Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Dark Sleep Radio. I'm here to share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies, aiming to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from. Find a comfy spot, relax, and let's get started. So it was a Sunday night, around 11:30, maybe edging towards midnight. I had been visiting my sister in Portsmouth, and though I originally didn't plan to stay late, I ended up doing just that. Instead of crashing on her couch again, I decided to drive back home. The journey usually takes about an hour and a half with no traffic, and I've made the drive multiple times, though rarely that late at night. About 20 minutes into the drive, a light fog began to form, swirling across the road in patches. I figured it would clear up soon, so I continued on Route 4, which cuts through fairly rural areas. No streetlights, gas stations, or much traffic, especially at that late hour. As I drove further, the fog thickened significantly. When I passed the Northwood turnoff, visibility was so poor I had to reduce my speed to about 35 miles per hour. My headlights barely made a dent in the fog, and using high beams only made visibility worse. It was like driving through soup. There were no other cars around, just me in this dense, eerie quiet that the fog seemed to amplify. It was around midnight when I reached a stretch near Deerfield, where the trees open up to fields on both sides. I'm familiar with the area. There's an old half-collapsed red barn out there, and some power lines running along the south side. It struck me how unusually quiet it was. No sounds of crickets or wind, just the hum of my tires and the occasional squeak from my wipers. Then, out of nowhere, my GPS glitched. I wasn't actively looking at it since I knew the route, but I noticed out of the corner of my eye that the screen had frozen. The voice had just instructed to continue on Route 4 before it went silent. There were no further directions, no rerouting, just a locked screen and the little blue arrow frozen in place. At the same moment, my radio, which had been playing a quiet public radio program, suddenly cut out. There was no static, no pop, just total silence, and the screen read no signal, as if I'd driven into a tunnel. But there was nothing overhead, or so I thought. Suddenly, I realized the fog above had turned pitch black, as if something was blocking the moonlight. I leaned forward over the steering wheel. Driving through the dark, I had to slow down to about 25 miles per hour because I couldn't see anything ahead. It was like a black ceiling was over the car. I tried to make out familiar landmarks through the driver's side window, but even the barn and power lines were swallowed by shadows. Curious, I rolled down the window just a bit and reached my hand out, expecting to feel the chill of rain or at least a breeze. But there was nothing, just a strange pressure and a subtle vibration that felt more like a pulse than any sound. Inside the car, the lights started acting up. It wasn't like a battery dying, slowly dimming out. This was different, as if something was draining the light right out of them. The dash, the GPS, even the faint blue light from my charger, all seemed like they were being dimmed by an unseen hand. Glancing at the dash clock, it read 12:04, then blinked and froze. I tapped it, half expecting it to respond. With visibility down to a few feet, I clutched the steering wheel, my hands cramping from the tension. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything snapped back to normal. The lights blazed back to life, the GPS updated my location, and the radio cut back in mid-sentence as if it had been merely paused. Looking up, the oppressive black had lifted, replaced by a light fog illuminated faintly by the moon. I pulled over, Ken, my hands trembling as I tried to make sense of it. The clock now read 12:15. When I checked my phone, it was 12:26. That struck me as odd because my phone and the car usually showed the same time, synced to the same network. I even took a screenshot, puzzled by the discrepancy. The rest of the drive was uneventful. The fog cleared as I neared Epsom, and by the time I reached the 393 split, it had completely dissipated. I arrived home by 1:30, still trying to process the night's strange events. It wasn't until later, reflecting on the ordeal, that I realized the time anomaly was particularly bizarre. I'd only driven about a quarter mile during that strange episode, which felt like it lasted maybe 45 seconds, not the 2 minutes the clock suggested. The next day, I tested my perception by timing myself. From everything off to everything back on, it was 47 seconds. Curious, I drove the same stretch of road again a week later in daylight. Everything was normal. The barn and power lines were just as they should be. Nothing out of the ordinary happened, but the experience lingered in my mind, especially the way time seemed to warp during those lost minutes. I was driving back from my brother's place late at night, around 11:30 p.m. He lives on the outskirts of town, and I decided to take the back roads home. I prefer them over the interstate, which is always flooded with semis and just stresses me out. These back roads are familiar to me. They're quieter and less hurried. I had my windows down slightly and the music turned low, just cruising along in a sort of peaceful fatigue. The road I was on is a 2-lane stretch that slices through a national forest. For about 10 or 15 miles, there are no houses, streetlights, or signs, just a dense wall of trees on either side and the occasional reflective post. It's a path I've driven many times, usually without seeing another soul, especially at night. It feels peaceful, yet there's an eerie vibe when you're out there alone. Just after crossing a wooden bridge over a creek, this one's without guardrails, I noticed something odd. It wasn't on the road, but rather hovering above the tree line to my left. It looked like a flare at first, glowing orange-red and rising slowly, maybe a couple or 300 feet up. It wasn't moving fast like a firework, just a steady, cautious ascent. Curious, I slowed down and turned down the music to keep an eye on it. As I continued to watch, this glowing object climbed about 30 feet more, then just stopped and stayed there. It didn't flicker or leave a trail of smoke, and there was no crackling sound like you would hear with fireworks. Intrigued, I pulled over and killed the engine, wanting a better listen. The night was eerily silent. No wind, no bugs, nothing. The object just hung there above the trees, perfectly still, not pulsing or dimming, almost as if it was watching or waiting. Stepping out of the car, I stared at it for a good minute. It seemed too high for a drone, and besides, drones aren't silent. They have a distinct buzzing noise that's usually audible from a distance. But this thing, it was completely silent. I stood there in the middle of the road, the only human for miles, under this bizarre, glowing silence. It remained motionless for nearly 2 minutes. I've since avoided driving at night, especially in foggy conditions. Something about that experience, under what felt like a massive presence, left me uneasy. It might not sound like much when I say the lights flickered, the GPS cut out, big deal, right? But at that moment, it felt profound, as if something huge was hovering over me, watching. I've never mentioned this to anyone, not even my sister, whom I managed to call from that very spot, a place I'd later realize was a dead zone for cell reception. I was just standing there on the road, feeling out of place, like I wasn't meant to witness what was happening. The object began to ascend, not quickly at first, but with a smooth acceleration, and then it disappeared straight up into the clouds. There was no sound at all, no sonic boom, no trailing lights. It just vanished. I stayed put for another minute or two, straining my ears for any sound, but heard nothing. Looking around, I half expected to find someone else who might have seen it, but it was just me, the trees, and the road. Climbing back into my car, I drove off, pushing the speed a little as I kept my eyes on the overcast sky through the windshield. No stars, no moon, just darkness. A few minutes into the drive, something felt off about the road. I know that route well. It's usually a straight shot for miles. But after crossing the bridge, there should have been a sharp curve near a marker sign for an old logging trail. I never saw it. I hadn't turned off, yet somehow I was already approaching the big junction where the road meets the highway again, as if I'd skipped a whole section. Glancing at the dashboard clock, it read 11:53. I'd only parked on the road for about 5 minutes, but this stretch should have taken at least 20. It was like I'd lost 10 minutes. I wasn't tired or anything. I hadn't been drinking. I remember everything up to that point clearly. The stop, seeing the light, watching it shoot up, then driving again. Nothing unusual in between. I got home by 12:10 and just sat in the driveway for a while. I checked my phone for any news on strange lights or drones, but nothing turned up. Local sites were quiet. The weather radar showed just overcast skies and light winds. There were no reports of flares or weather balloons, just a normal night. At first, I didn't tell anyone. It didn't seem like something I could easily explain. The next night, I went back to the same spot and parked there. I waited for over an hour, but nothing happened. I even ventured a little into the woods off the road, looking for any sign of a scorch mark or evidence of someone launching something like a flare. But there was nothing there, just leaves, sticks, and the dark outlines of trees. For weeks, I kept dreaming about that moment. The glow hanging above the trees in utter silence. Sometimes, in the dreams, it would drop lower rather than rising. Occasionally, I'd hear breathing, which didn't make sense, but that's how it felt. A month later, I returned during the day just to see if things looked different in the sunlight. I hiked into the woods from where I'd stopped the car. I was out in my backyard around midnight, setting up my camera to capture the moon. Astronomy has been a hobby of mine for a while, and I take every chance I get to use my own equipment. That night, with the nearly full moon hanging low and bright against a clear sky, I was aiming for close-up shots to capture the craters and their shadows. I live on the edge of a small town where light pollution isn't too bad, so the moon's brightness was perfect for photography. I had my tripod set up, my DSLR mounted with a telephoto lens, and I was busy adjusting the settings. I was focused on getting the exposure right and waiting for a thin haze to drift away from the moon. After a few test shots, I switched to continuous shooting mode, planning to pick the best photo later. It was a quiet night, just a light breeze and the occasional rustle of leaves. As I kept an eye on the moon through my camera's LCD, waiting for the perfect lighting, suddenly I noticed something move across the moon's surface in the live view. It wasn't just a spot or a mark. It was a distinct, dark shape, like a shadow. I'd never seen anything like it before. In a completely different setting, deep in a dense forest where no clearings or campsites could be found, I experienced something equally strange. It was a place so thick with trees that I doubt any vehicle, not even a queen, small one, could have made it through. There were no tire tracks, no footpaths, just endless woods. However, about 50 yards in, I noticed something unusual about a section of trees. The bark on these trees was smoother and paler, as if something had rubbed against them in a circular pattern at shoulder height. This affected maybe 5 or 6 trees, forming a wide arc with this peculiar, worn look. There were no fallen branches or any obvious cause for this pattern. It was as if something had passed through gently yet deliberately. I didn't linger long after discovering this, and I kept the experience to myself for almost a year. It was hard to explain. I hadn't seen a spaceship, nothing had chased me, and I hadn't been taken anywhere. But the odd light, the way it moved, the silence, and the time discrepancy stayed with me. Now, when I drive that same road, even in daylight, I find myself looking up through the trees, half expecting to see something unusual again. Though I haven't seen anything since, I always slow down near the bridge and keep looking, just in case. One night, I noticed something odd moving across the moon. It was too large to be a bird or a plane, and its movement was unusual, not like any satellite or piece of debris. The object was oval-shaped and glided smoothly over the moon's bright surface. Curious, I zoomed in with my camera to get a clearer look and started snapping pictures as it moved. It took less than a minute for it to cross from one side of the moon to the other before vanishing. Initially, I wondered if it was just a camera glitch or maybe a smudge on the lens or sensor. To be sure, I cleaned and checked the lens, but the mysterious shape was still visible in every photo on my camera screen. I transferred the images to my computer and zoomed in further. The object's edges were smooth yet clearly defined, ruling out a blur or artifact. It didn't match any known aircraft or bird silhouette, especially given its size, and it didn't resemble the fast-moving tiny dots that satellites usually appear as. Feeling unsettled, I stared at the pictures. The excitement I usually feel from astronomy was replaced by a heavy, eerie sense that something was watching or hovering above me. This wasn't like anything I'd experienced before. Determined to understand what I saw, I set up my camera again the next night under a clear sky. Hoping to capture the shape again, or at least something that could explain what I had seen, I waited. But nothing appeared. The moon was just quiet and still. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about the shape. I showed the photos to a few friends who are also into astronomy. They proposed various explanations like clouds or camera glitches, but none seemed to fit what was clearly captured in the images. I began paying more attention to the night sky, occasionally noticing odd lights moving at strange speeds, too slow for planes but too fast for any typical aircraft. These lights would hover or change direction silently, but every time I tried to focus my telescope or camera on them, they disappeared. Then, one night, without my camera, I was simply watching the moon when I heard a faint, distant humming sound, almost like a distant generator. It was so soft I thought I was imagining it, but then that unsettling feeling of being watched crept over me again. I looked around. The street was empty, the houses dark, no people, no cars, just quiet and still. Over the past week, the moon has been shining brightly, and I started sensing something odd, like a presence just out of sight. Whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there, yet I felt it was always lurking nearby. My sleep deteriorated. I'd wake up sweaty with my heart racing, unable to recall any dreams. There were also these weird moments when time seemed off. I'd glance at the clock, unsure if it had been minutes or just seconds. One night, after some photography, I left my camera on its tripod outside. The next morning, I reviewed the footage and noticed something strange in the shots of the moon. Just before a dark shape crossed it, there was a faint shimmer in the air above the treetops, like the air itself was bending. It wasn't a reflection or glare, just a subtle warp that normalized quickly. After witnessing that, I no longer felt comfortable going out late with my camera. It seemed as though whatever was out there preferred not to be observed too closely. However, I still have those images saved on my hard drive. Every now and then, I look at them, trying to make sense of the dark shape that moves slowly across the moon, larger and stranger than anything typical. Nowadays, when I gaze up at the night sky, I can't help but wonder if it's still up there, watching from a place I just can't see. Recently, Matt and I went hiking on a familiar ridge trail just outside town. It was late afternoon, the sun was setting, but it was still light enough that we didn't need our jackets. We were quiet, mostly listening to the crunch of our boots and the occasional call of a bird. Nothing out of the ordinary. That first day, it was just us, and we made light conversation about bringing someone else along next time. When Sarah joined us a week later, it felt like the right decision. On that initial hike with Matt, as the daylight began to fade and shadows grew longer, we climbed a small rise at the trail's end. The trees thinned out, offering a view of the valley and distant ridges. As I admired the view, Matt stopped abruptly and pointed, his voice tense. "Hey, what the hell is that?" he asked. I looked where he was pointing and saw something unusual, a metallic, round object, like a weather balloon or a drone, just hovering there. High above the ridge, there was an object, perfectly still as if glued to the sky. It didn't drift or sway, it just hung there, defying the breeze. The sunlight hit it, making it glimmer slightly, though not like a mirror. It was more like a dull metal surface, perhaps steel or aluminum, unmarked and smooth, and seemed about the size of a car, maybe larger. Distance made it hard to be certain. Matt and I could only stare, frozen for a moment by the sight. It was out of place against the backdrop of endless forest and rolling hills. "Do you think it's some kind of drone?" I wondered aloud. But Matt was quick to dismiss that. "No drone I know would just hover like that without making a sound or moving," he replied. True enough, the silence was unsettling. No buzzing, no hum, nothing. We tried to capture it with our phones, zooming in as much as we could, but it was no use. Our cameras couldn't pick up any details. It was just a smooth disc, suspended there without even a shadow underneath it. The light around it was strange too, as if it wasn't fully interacting with its surroundings. We whispered speculations back and forth, not expecting any real answers. Then, impulsively, Matt suggested we get Sarah to take a look. We rushed down the trail to find her, keeping the disc in sight. It remained motionless, as if waiting. We met Sarah about 10 minutes later at the trailhead and hurried her back up to our vantage point. But by then, the disc was gone, just empty sky and the rustling leaves. We called out and searched the skies, half expecting to see or hear something that would explain the sudden disappearance, but there was nothing. No engine noise, no disturbance, like it had simply vanished. We lingered, hoping it reappear, but the quiet was profound, almost tangible. That night, and for days afterward, we couldn't stop discussing it. The questions multiplied. Why hover there so silently? Why no movement? How could it disappear without a trace? None of it made sense. Sleep was elusive as we turned it over in our minds. I kept an eye on the news and scoured local reports, hoping for anything that might explain what we saw, but there was nothing. Matt even noted that his phone's GPS and compass had acted up during our hike, glitching inexplicably. The mystery lingered, unanswered. I was out flying my drone in a large open field just outside town, enjoying the late afternoon warmth of early fall. It's a great spot for flying because there are no tall obstacles to interfere with the signal, and the sky is usually clear, perfect for capturing good footage. I had the drone up, capturing slow sweeping shots of the horizon and trees, experimenting with a new camera angle for a project. Everything was going smoothly. The drone buzzed softly overhead, and a gentle breeze ruffled the tops of the grass. Then suddenly, the screen on my controller flickered and went dead. The drone lost its signal. I thought it might be a brief glitch, or maybe some interference, so I started moving around, waving the controller to reconnect. But nothing worked. The drone didn't return to its home position like it usually would, and the controller gave no warning beeps. The screen remained blank. Concerned, I walked towards the last known position of the drone, keeping an eye on the sky in case it was still airborne. The field was mostly grass with some patches of dirt and scattered wildflowers. Eventually, I found the drone sitting on the ground near a small grove of trees at the edge of the field. There was no visible damage, which was puzzling considering the complete signal loss. I took the drone back to my truck and plugged the SD card into my laptop to check the footage. Initially, everything on the video appeared normal. Sarah and I had seen something strange earlier. As we were out on the trail, she mentioned her watch had lost signal briefly around the same time we spotted a mysterious disk in the sky. We tried to return to the trail a few times, but something felt off. The usual quiet of the place felt different, as if something was watching us. We never saw the disk again, and it wasn't a plane, a drone, or anything identifiable. It simply hovered silently, then disappeared without a sound, movement, or trail. I'm still trying to figure out what it was, but I haven't come close to an explanation. While I was flying my drone over a field, capturing smooth shots of the landscape, something unusual happened about 2 minutes before the video feed abruptly ended. Initially, the camera was pointing upwards, capturing the thickening gray clouds slowly drifting across the late afternoon sky. Suddenly, a metallic shape caught my eye. It wasn't like any airplane or weather balloon I'd ever seen. This object wasn't exactly solid. It appeared more as a dim, reflective blur, with well-defined edges that made it resemble a thin, flat panel or a piece of metal floating in the air. It moved slowly, almost as if it was drifting. Then, without warning, it changed direction sharply and precisely. The drone camera managed to capture this for about 10 seconds, giving me just enough time to get a clear view before the feed ended abruptly, without any static or glitches. I replayed that footage repeatedly, trying to persuade myself it was merely a trick of light or an odd cloud formation, but the movement was too deliberate. The way it shifted direction didn't seem natural for a cloud or a bird. The following day, I returned to the field, driven by a need to understand what might have caused the interference with my drone. However, the field felt eerily quiet, devoid of the usual sounds of birds chirping or wind rustling through the grass. It was as if the area was holding its breath. When I tried to fly the drone again, the controls were unresponsive, and the signal was weak, accompanied by occasional flickers of faint static on the screen. Frustrated, I began to pack up when I noticed a pale blue light hovering low over the grass at the field's edge, near where I had retrieved my drone the previous day. The light wasn't bright but emitted a soft glow, pulsing slowly twice. I stared, frozen, wondering if it was merely a reflection from a distant window or car headlights, though no cars or houses were nearby. Then, as abruptly as it appeared, the light vanished, like someone had flipped a switch. Since that day, I've had an unsettling feeling of being watched. Every time I looked up at the sky, it felt as if something unseen was tracking me. I kept checking my phone, half expecting messages or calls, but my phone seemed as disconnected from the world as I felt. I was about 10 years old, out in the field behind our house one evening, right as the sky turned that soft, fading blue you see just before sunset. There wasn't much of a breeze, which made it strange that my simple, diamond-shaped kite with its bright red tail even stayed aloft. I recall trying to get it to fly higher, but it mostly just bobbed awkwardly a few feet above me. Clinging tightly to the little plastic spool, I was determined not to lose my kite. Suddenly, the string jerked upward violently, not like the wind had caught it, but as if something invisible had grabbed and yanked it straight up. My fingers slipped on the spool, but shock prevented me from letting go. The kite shot up faster than my eyes could follow, moving perfectly vertically without flapping or twisting, as if reeled in by some unseen machine above the clouds. I stared upward until the kite became a tiny dot, moving as though pulled by a string too tight for this world. Then, just as quickly, the tension disappeared. The kite vanished from sight, and the string dropped back down, limp. Years later, I had another strange experience involving flying, but this time with a drone. I was in a field late one afternoon, the same time I'd previously lost signal, setting up my drone. I looked around, waited, but nothing unusual happened. No odd lights, no buzzing, no interference. I flew the drone for half an hour, captured some good shots, and took it home. However, those nights right after were tough. I'd hear odd noises outside my window, a low humming or occasional tapping that I couldn't quite pinpoint, never lasting long and never within clear view. For a while, I stopped flying the drone, needing time to make sense of what I might have seen or if it was all in my head. Weeks later, I returned to the field. Again, nothing out of the ordinary occurred. Even now, I can't explain what was in those clouds or why my drone lost contact that day. Sometimes, when I gaze up at a clear sky, I think I catch a glimpse of something out of place, something moving differently from the wind or birds, something I still can't quite grasp. The whole ordeal with my kite only lasted about 20 seconds, yet it seemed much longer. After composing myself, I went to find the kite, which was no longer in the field. It turned out to be a few yards away, tangled in the branches of a tall tree by the wood's edge. The kite was in bad shape, with its fabric ripped into jagged strips and its frame bent and broken. Oddly, there was hardly any wind that whole evening. In fact, the weather report the next day confirmed that the wind speed had been 0 for hours around the time of the incident. This left me puzzled about what could have thrown the kite with such force into the tree. When I told my parents, they didn't believe me. They thought I might have gotten tangled in the string and fallen, joking about a mysterious kite monster. But I knew what I had experienced. That night, trouble sleeping crept in as faint, unsettling sounds came from outside, soft rustling that seemed to echo around the trees. Peering out, I only saw the usual play of shadows from the branches, yet nothing Ahmed right. The sounds were too quiet for an animal, but too persistent to be the wind, almost like something was breathing out there. The next day, I returned to the tree where the kite was still caught, the pieces fluttering slightly in the breeze. Scanning the ground, I noticed no footprints or signs of anyone else's presence, no broken branches, nothing to indicate how the kite ended up in that tree, or that anyone had climbed up after it. Over the following week, I visited that field multiple times, standing with the kite spool in hand, but nothing happened. The sky remained still, and I couldn't get the kite to lift again, no matter how hard I tried. Then, one afternoon while sitting on the porch, I noticed my dog intensely staring into the woods near that tree. He growled low, his fur bristled, but when I looked, I saw nothing, no people, no animals, just the trees and their shadows. This feeling of being watched started to grow on me, especially in the late afternoons or early evenings near that field. It wasn't the feeling of a person watching, but something else. Something silently observing, waiting without movement. As days passed, the mystery of what happened that evening with the kite lingered, leaving more questions than answers. I was walking home from the field as the sun set, the sky mostly clear, with just a few thin clouds near the horizon. Suddenly, I noticed a pale light near the treetops, something that seemed out of place. It wasn't like any light from a flashlight or a car. It hovered and pulsed softly before it faded away. That night, I told my dad about what I saw. He brushed it off, suggesting it was just my imagination getting the better of me because of the kite. But I knew something was strange. I wasn't imagining how the kite's string pulled straight up, or how abruptly the kite vanished, or even the dog's startled reaction. The area around where the kite had been just felt quieter, emptier, as if something had passed through and taken the sounds with it. Haunted by that experience, I eventually stopped visiting the field. The unease I felt wasn't the kind you get from a scary movie or a bad dream. It was a deep, lingering discomfort that kept me indoors after sunset. Years later, I drove past that same field. The tree where the kite got tangled had fallen during a storm. The remnants of the kite were long gone, yet the memory of that eerie evening lingered. I still had no answers about what pulled the kite or why it ended up shredded in that tree, especially with no wind to blame. I hadn't shared this experience with anyone outside my family. Even now, it crosses my mind occasionally, particularly on those still, windless days when I see a kite hanging motionless in the sky. One night, long after the kite incident, I woke up to a faint glow peeking through my curtains. Initially, I thought it might be a car passing by, but the light was steady, emanating from outside my bedroom window. Curious, I pulled the curtains aside. The backyard floodlight was on, which was odd because I was sure I had turned it off before bed. I always do, unless I'm expecting someone or have to be outside late. Grabbing my phone, I stepped outside to investigate. The night was calm, filled only with distant car noises, occasional dog barks, and the soft rustle of leaves in a light breeze. Yet, the first thing I noticed wasn't the unexpected light, but the lawn chairs. Normally left scattered on the patio, that night, all 4 chairs were meticulously arranged, which was completely out of the ordinary. My backyard, with its locked gate and fence that runs the entire length, backs up to some trees. It's not a large area, and the gate is always securely locked at night. One morning, I found the backyard chairs arranged in a perfect spiral, the smallest circle at the center, as if someone had taken their time to deliberate. Ely set them that way. The sight was unsettling because there were no signs that anyone had been there. The ground was dry, undisturbed, and there were no footprints in the grass or dirt. I examined the surroundings for any clues. The patio, fence, and gate showed no signs of forced entry. It struck me as odd because moving the chairs into such a precise pattern would require someone to be there. Yet there was nothing. Not even the neighbor's kid could have done it. They were out of town that weekend. The chairs themselves were cool to the touch and not worn, as I would have expected under the strong floodlight that cast long shadows into the yard. Walking around the spiral, I found nothing out of place. That's when I remembered the motion camera I had installed a few weeks earlier to monitor the yard. I pulled up the app on my phone, expecting to find some motion alerts or a recording from the night, but found nothing. The app reported that the camera was offline. I tapped the refresh button a few times, but it remained offline. I tried resetting the connection, but it wouldn't come back online. This was unusual because the camera typically worked fine, even in bad weather. Standing under the floodlight, I felt a bit on edge. I thought maybe I had simply forgotten to turn off the floodlight before bed, but the meticulously arranged chairs puzzled me. I double-checked the house, locked the back door just in case, and went back to bed. However, I found myself staring out the window at the spiral of chairs under the floodlight for a long time. Over the next few days, I half expected someone, perhaps my neighbor, to come by and offer an explanation, or at least for some clue to appear. But nothing happened. No one came forward, and the chairs remained in that eerie spiral. I tried moving them back to their usual spots, but by the next morning, they were arranged in the spiral once again, in the same perfect pattern, with no footprints or signs of anyone having been there. At first, it was just minor stuff that I noticed. My phone's battery, which was typically reliable, started dying quicker than usual. I'd also see the lights in my house flicker every now and then. At night, there were these faint hums, almost like low electrical noises, but every time I got up to check, everything seemed normal. Then, things got stranger. Sometimes, when I looked out of the window, I noticed the floodlight in my backyard would turn off and then flick on again without any trigger from the timer or the motion camera. Which, by the way, I couldn't get working again, no matter how hard I tried. One night, I even heard what sounded like someone shuffling slowly across the grass, but when I went to check, there was nobody there. Feeling a bit unsettled and unable to shake the thought that something odd was happening, I set up my phone to record video through the window, aiming it at the backyard. I was hoping to catch whatever was going on. Reviewing the footage the next day, I noticed that around 3:14 a.m., the floodlight switched on without any apparent reason, and the chairs in the yard started shifting slightly, moving closer together in a spiral formation. Oddly enough, there was no one on the camera, no figures or shadows, just the chairs moving as if nudged by an unseen hand. And it was a still night. There wasn't even a breeze. After that, I felt a constant sense of being watched, not directly, but as if something was lingering just out of my line of sight, maybe hovering at the edges of the yard or perched up in the trees. One evening, I sat outside on the patio, trying to convince myself it was all just a bizarre prank or coincidence. But then, a soft tapping on the fence startled me. Heart racing, I stood up quickly and looked around. Nothing. I checked my phone, only to find the battery nearly dead again, though I had just charged. I rushed inside and locked the door. That tapping haunted the silence of my house. The next morning, the backyard was exactly as I left it, chairs still spiraling and the grass untouched. I didn't get much sleep after that. The floodlight continued its erratic behavior, turning on and off several times each night, while the motion camera remained unresponsive. I mentioned these events to a few friends, but they either laughed it off or suggested perhaps an animal was causing the mischief. Yet, nothing explained the unease that lingered with me, day after day. About 2 weeks after strange things began happening, I found myself sitting on the patio late at night. The floodlight was off, and the moonlight lit up the yard. As I stared at the spiral of chairs, the air turned cold and heavy, much like it feels before a storm. Then I saw something that I still can't make sense of, a faint, grayish shape hovering above the spiral. It was blurry and shifting, almost like smoke or fog, but there was no wind and no fog in sight. I looked away for just a second, and when I turned back, it had vanished. I went back inside quickly, locking up and avoiding the chairs. The bizarre occurrences didn't stop there. The floodlights began turning on at random, and the chair spiral stayed strangely perfect. The motion camera never worked again. Sometimes, late at night, I'd hear soft footsteps or movement from behind the fence. I couldn't tell what was out there or what was moving the chairs, but every time I saw the spiral under the floodlight, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. One evening, after a long day, I was up late with the baby monitor in my hand, enjoying some quiet while my 5-month-old daughter finally slept. It was around midnight when the monitor started to act up. It wasn't the usual static or little beeps. It started with a loud crackle that turned into a deep, low humming sound. It was unlike any machine I'd heard before, a monotone vibration that sounded like a distant giant engine. Then, suddenly, everything went silent. Panicked, I rushed to her room, flicked on the light, and there she was, just lying there peacefully. I woke up a little after 5 because my dog started whining. She usually sleeps quietly at the foot of the bed. As I tried to settle back to sleep, I noticed my daughter completely still in her crib, staring out the window with her eyes wide open. She wasn't fussing or moving like she normally does before falling asleep, and she was eerily silent. Concerned, I softly called her name, but she didn't react. When I picked her up, she didn't blink or look at me properly, though her breathing was steady and normal. Outside, the night was quiet with no cars or people around. I looked out the window myself, but only saw the streetlights casting long shadows and the moon partially hidden behind clouds. Holding my daughter, she eventually blinked and looked around as if waking from a trance. After putting her back in her crib and watching her until she moved normally, I returned to the living room and picked up the baby monitor, which was oddly silent and flickering faintly. I spent a long time trying to convince myself it was just a glitch, but it felt like something had caught her attention outside in an unsettling way. The next morning, I asked my husband if he had heard anything strange, but he hadn't, and the monitor looked normal when I showed it to him. Strangely, the monitor hadn't recorded anything out of the ordinary. and there were no saved sounds or alerts on the app. During the day, I checked the window for any signs that could explain her behavior. No scratches, bugs, or reflections, just our usual backyard with some trees. Over the next few nights, I kept the monitor close and checked it obsessively. Sometimes it would crackle with static, but there was never any deep hum like before. She never stared out the window like that again, and I still don't know what happened that night. It seemed like something was there, or at least close enough to show up on the monitor. Whatever it was, it left no trace, no noise outside, no marks on the window, no disturbance. But the silence on the monitor after that humming felt heavier than quiet should be, as if something was waiting or watching. For those 30 seconds, the house didn't quite feel like mine anymore. My dog woke me up in the middle of the night, needing to go outside. She's getting up there in years, so I figured her bladder was acting up again. I didn't really think much of it and slid the back door open, but she just froze, staring out into the yard. I tried nudging her, but she wouldn't move. That's when the smell hit me. It was a sharp, almost electrical smell, like burnt plastic. Curious, I stepped out barefoot onto the porch. It wasn't a strong smell, and I thought maybe the neighbors had something burning in a fire pit the night before, but I couldn't tell where it was coming from. Looking around, I noticed the yard was covered in a pitch-black dust. It wasn't like dirt or mulch or ash, but more like charcoal powder, spread mostly in a 10-foot circle in the center of the yard. Near the house, there were lighter streaks, and even the porch steps had faint smudges, as if someone with sooty shoes had walked up and then vanished. I touched the dust. It was dry, fine, and clung to my fingers without any moisture or grit. The sky was overcast and barely light, no smoke or fast-moving clouds, just a heavy stillness. Unnervingly, it was completely silent, no birds chirping, which was unusual for our yard. I called to the dog again, but she just backed away and hid behind the door frame, something she's never done before, not even during thunderstorms. I stood there for a while, puzzled, trying to make sense of it. I live in the suburbs, far from any factories or construction sites that might explain this strange black dust. If it had been from a fire, I would have expected ash flakes or a smoky scent, but this was different, too fine and evenly distributed. Eventually, I grabbed my phone and took a few photos. The dust was hard to capture unless I got the angle just right, but you could see the contrast where it thinned in the grass. I sent a photo to my friend Jenna, who works early mornings, asking if she'd ever seen anything like it. She didn't respond immediately, so I just made some coffee and periodically checked the yard through the blinds. By 8:30, everything was back to normal. The yard was clean, as if the black powder had never been there. There were no smudges on the porch, the grass was its normal color, and even the strange smell had disappeared. I went out and stood where the dust had been, still trying to figure out what had happened. Earlier that day, I noticed some smudges on the porch steps and made a mental note to clean them later. However, when I checked again, there was no trace of them. It was bizarre, like they had been meticulously wiped clean. Even stranger, my dog refused to go outside. She wouldn't chase her ball or even step over the threshold, instead just sniffing the air and pacing nervously. She didn't touch her water bowl outside either. At first, I wondered if I had imagined everything, maybe just a trick of my sleepy brain. But then I checked the photos on my phone. There they were, clear as day, including one with my own boot print in the dust. I tried to match my boot to the print again, but the ground looked untouched, perfectly normal. Unable to sleep, I ended up researching possible explanations online. Black powder in yards, volcanic ash fallout, mildew, mold, pollution, but nothing fit what I had seen, and absolutely nothing explained how it could all disappear in just a few hours. Around 11, my friend Jen finally texted back. She suggested it might be from a busted transformer or a firework, recalling a similar incident after a substation explosion during a storm. But there had been no storms here, no loud noises in the night, and no power outages. All my clocks were normal. Throughout the day, I kept an eye on the yard, which remained spotless. In the afternoon, my dog ventured out, but only to the edge of the porch, quickly doing her business on the gravel, avoiding the grass at all costs. I even walked across the lawn barefoot to see if it felt different. it didn't. Just the usual cool, slightly damp grass in the shade. That night, I sat on the steps in the dark, trying to make sense of it all. I wasn't scared, just filled with an odd anticipation, as if waiting for something to happen. The neighborhood was silent, except for the distant sound of cars and the faint tinkle of wind chimes. My yard was still too. No wind, no bugs, not even the trees swayed. As I watched a plane blink slowly across the sky, I couldn't help but wonder if it had anything to do with the weirdness in my yard. I thought I saw a flicker of light over the fence a little after 10 one night, like someone flashing a small mirror from afar. It lasted just a second, and I got up to check if someone was using a flashlight or if there was someone in the woods behind my yard. But the light didn't reappear. I waited around for about 15 minutes, but eventually went inside. The next morning, my dog was barking at the sliding door, not just whining, but genuinely barking. I checked, but nothing was out of the ordinary outside, yet she refused to go near the door for the entire day. Several days later, I showed some pictures to a friend who works in environmental testing. He suggested it might have been industrial dust from the highway. I wasn't convinced, though, because the distribution was too even, and it vanished without any wind or rain, which seemed odd. Now and then, I still walk around the yard looking for any signs that it ever happened. The grass looks fine, no discoloration, burn rings, new growth, or dead spots. But the dog won't go near that part of the yard anymore, sticking to the patio or doing her business at the front. I haven't mentioned anything to the neighbors. I'm not sure what I'd even say. Every so often, I look at the pictures again. They seem blurry now, and the black powder isn't as visible as I remember, but the boot print is still there with the same tread pattern as my hiking boots. I haven't cleaned the porch since. I just want to see if anything comes back. In late October, I went up to this small clearing near the Catskills, not an official campsite, just a flat spot off an old logging road I've been visiting for years. My uncle introduced it to me when I was a teenager. I like it because it's quiet, and I can be alone, away from everyone. There's no cell service, no headlights, just woods and sky. I got there around 4 in the afternoon, which gave me just enough time to set up before it started getting dark. It was colder than expected. The leaves had mostly fallen, and the branches were thin and bare. I made a small fire, cooked some sausage and beans, nothing special. I didn't play any music or listen to a podcast. I just sat, drank, and watched the fire burn down. Around 10 or so, the flames had mostly died down, and I was lying in my sleeping bag with my head poking out, just looking at the sky. The night was extraordinarily clear, making every single star visible, from the glowing band of the Milky Way to those tiny, faint flickers at the periphery of my sight. As someone who often stargazes, I have a little hobby of tracking satellites as they smoothly sail across the sky, usually disappearing behind a tree or dimming as they enter Earth's shadow. Around 10:30 p.m., I saw one, then another, and another. An hour later, feeling sleepy, I rolled to my side, zipped up my sleeping bag to my chest, but kept watching the stars through my tense mesh. Suddenly, something unusual caught my attention. Initially, it seemed like just another satellite, a faint white dot moving slowly across the sky. But then I noticed there were several, maybe 7 or 8, all arranged in a strange pattern. They moved steadily, without blinking or trailing like meteors, more like a cluster of lights maintaining a perfect grid, akin to the dots on a die, evenly spaced and oddly still. I blinked several times, half expecting my tired eyes were playing tricks on me, but they remained, slowly shifting across the sky in perfect formation. Over a couple of minutes, they covered a significant portion of the sky, staying in that precise arrangement. I felt a weird pressure in my gut, an uneasy sensation that something wasn't right, though I wasn't exactly scared. Compelled, I sat up, unzipped my tent completely for a clearer view. The night was silent, no rustling leaves, no breeze, just the last of the embers from the fire going out. The lights, or stars, or whatever they were, continued their silent glide overhead, consistent in brightness and size. Then, as abruptly as they appeared, they vanished. No dimming, no fading, just gone. The patch of sky where they had been seemed darker, as though a square had been cut out from the night itself. I kept staring, trying to make sense of it, feeling oddly stiff as if I hadn't moved for hours. I glanced at my watch. It was 1:17 a.m., much later than I thought, adding to the night's strangeness. I remember glancing at my watch and seeing it was around 11:30 p.m. I couldn't believe I might have fallen asleep because the fire hadn't dimmed at all. Then the soft clicking sound started, irregular and sporadic, seeming to come from the trees in every direction. They weren't like any animal or human noises, just occasional ticks that made me turn my head this way and that. There was nothing visibly moving, but I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. It wasn't just my imagination running wild in the dark. It felt intense, like standing in the spotlight on a stage. Uneasy, I retreated to my tent, zipping it only halfway so I could keep an eye on the outside. I didn't dare lie down. Instead, I sat up, fixated on a particularly dark patch of sky. It was an odd sort of dark, dense like ink, swallowing any light from the surrounding stars, which normally shone bright. Time seemed to stand still. My watch stuck at 1:17 a.m. I tapped on it, hoping it was just stuck, but no luck. The clicking eventually faded, or maybe I just stopped noticing. I'm not sure how long I sat there, but by the time I noticed the light changing, it was already the blue-gray of early dawn. My watch had moved to 6:02 a.m. Stepping outside, the cold remains of the fire greeted me, and everything seemed normal. My car was untouched, no signs of any wildlife or disturbances, except for my compass. It was spinning aimlessly, unable to find north. I packed up quickly, skipping my usual morning routine of coffee and breakfast, driven by a strong desire to leave. The drive back was uneventful, and as I neared the highway, my phone reconnected to the service. I'd returned to that spot a couple more times, once during the day and another overnight stay a year later, but nothing out of the ordinary happened again. I never experienced that deep, empty patch of sky or the strange behavior of my compass, which I eventually threw away. That day had started unusually for me, too. I woke up at 4:40 a.m., feeling disoriented as if coming out of a deep sleep, despite typically waking up early naturally. The sky was still dark as I awoke. I always start my day the same way: coffee, then boots, and off to check the fields. It's been my routine for the last 20 years. But this May, morning was different. As soon as I stepped through the back door and onto the porch, the silence struck me. Not a bird, bug, or the whisper of wind in the trees, a stark contrast to the usual morning chorus. The ground, which should have been soft from yesterday's light rain, was unexpectedly bone dry. I even squatted down to rub some dirt between my fingers, just to be sure. Flicking on my flashlight, I headed towards the pasture to check on the cows, a small herd of 15. The pasture, just a quarter acre behind the barn with a couple of feed troughs, was where I found them. It was still dark, and at first I couldn't see them. But turning the corner of the barn, I stopped dead in my tracks. There they were, all 15 of them, lined up in the middle of the field. They weren't grazing, lying down, or moving at all. Just standing there, eerily still, all facing the same direction. Not perfectly in line, but enough to be noticeable. They were silent too. No huffs, no shifting weight, no swishing tails. It was as if they were frozen. I waited there for a full minute, expecting at least one to move, but nothing happened. Their ears didn't even flick. I thought maybe they were spooked by a predator, but there were no signs of coyotes or dogs around. I tried whistling, like I usually do, but they didn't react at all. Then I noticed the weather vane on the barn. It was spinning slowly, steadily, in a counterclockwise direction. That old thing is usually stuck unless a big storm hits, and there wasn't even a breeze. Curious and a bit unnerved, I walked further into the field, about 30 feet in. That's when I felt it. A strange pressure in my chest, like the sensation of being underwater. It wasn't painful, just heavy. Everything seemed to slow down around me. My footsteps, the air, even the sound of gravel crunching under my boots felt delayed. I called out to the cows again, louder this time, but still, they didn't respond. No blinking, no tail swishing, just that same unnerving stare. Early in the morning, as the sun was just beginning to light up the sky, I noticed the cows were staring intently towards the east, maybe northeast. Puzzled by their unusual focus, I went to check on the barn and the surroundings. I took a flashlight to inspect the feed area, the grain bins, and the fence line. Everything was in order. No breaks, no tracks, and even the cows' water troughs were full, with no signs of disturbance. When I stepped outside again, I saw that the weather vane, which had been pointing east earlier, now faced west. Oddly, there was still no wind. A feeling of unease crept over me, not quite nausea, but a buzzing sensation inside, as if something was off. I leaned against the barn for support and noticed it felt unusually warm, warmer than the air. Suddenly, one of the cows moved. It was just one cow near the center at first, taking a step forward and letting out a low, rough grunt. Soon, another cow followed, and then another. Within 30 seconds, all the cows began shifting around and started grazing again, as if nothing had happened. As I watched them settle, I felt an overwhelming sense of solitude, as if I was the only awake being in a sleeping world. Checking the time on my phone, it read 5:07. It seemed I had only been outside for about 10 minutes. The whole situation felt strange enough that I went inside and noted the time on a sticky note, just in case I began to doubt or forget the details later. I didn't mention the incident to my wife immediately, thinking she might dismiss it as the cows being spooked by an animal. Later that afternoon, something else caught my attention. While filling the horse's water trough near the shed, I spotted a mark on the grass at the far end of the pasture. At first glance, it looked like a patch of dead grass, but on closer inspection, it was a perfect oval, flattened as if something heavy had rested there. The grass was bent inward from all directions with no tracks leading to or from the oval. It measured about 8 feet by 4 feet, located precisely where the cows had been looking earlier. I didn't dare touch it. I was 16 when it all happened, and for a long time, I didn't share it with anyone. Not because I was frightened of the repercussions, but because I couldn't find the words to describe it without sounding like I was making it up or losing my mind. It all started one early August day. Growing up, my dad often took me camping, which made me quite comfortable in the woods on my own. That day, I ventured about 5 miles north from our neighborhood along the old fire road and took a detour onto a side trail. It led to a small clearing I was fond of because it was quiet and secluded, probably too overgrown for most. I left home around noon with just a few essentials: water, a snack, a flashlight, and my phone. I wasn't planning an overnight stay, just a few hours to myself. The walk was uneventful, warm, and silent, with no one else in sight after the trailhead. I arrived at the clearing by 2 p.m., checked my phone for the time, and decided to relax. After eating a granola bar, I lay down in the grass. The thick summer heat made me doze off unintentionally. When I woke up, it was unexpectedly dusky. Not quite night, but the sky was a dim gray, overcast. That night, back at home, I couldn't sleep much. I stayed up late, watching the pasture outside my window. There were no odd occurrences, no strange lights or sounds, and importantly, no more frozen cows like before. In the morning, the strange mark in the grass was still there. The cows seemed to deliberately avoid it, grazing up to its edge and then sharply turning away. Curious, I walked through it myself once. The grass beneath my boots crunched as if sun-dried, yet the day hadn't been hot. There was a brief moment when the air felt cooler, but it was fleeting, and I thought little of it at the time. Over the following week, the mark gradually faded. By the 6th day, it was barely visible, yet I noticed the cows continued to steer clear of that spot. For about a month, I made it a routine to check the weather vane every morning, but it never spun again. Puzzled by these events, I began keeping a notebook, jotting down dates and any peculiar occurrences, sounds, lights, unusual animal behavior. But nothing that happened since has been quite like that morning. I glanced at my phone after waking up, and it was already 5:41 p.m. Surprisingly, I had been asleep for nearly 4 hours, which was unusual for me, especially on the ground. The silence around me was even stranger. This clearing was typically filled with the sounds of birds, crickets, and the rustling of leaves, but now it was eerily quiet, with no wind or movement from the trees. As I sat up, the stillness was stark. Noticing my backpack slightly unzipped was the next oddity. It looked as if someone had started to open it and then thought better of it. I always make sure it's securely closed, so this was definitely out of place. Beside the bag was my flashlight, just lying there as if someone had borrowed it and casually left it aside. I picked it up, turned it on, and found it working perfectly. Nothing else seemed to be missing. My water bottle was in place, and my phone had been in my pocket the whole time. Feeling uneasy, I scanned the tree line for any sign of movement, but saw nothing. Yet, the strong sense that I wasn't alone pushed me to move towards the center of the clearing instinctively. With no footprints and no sounds, just a persistent feeling in my chest, I decided it was best to leave, especially with nightfall approaching. I hurried back, not stopping until I reached the trailhead. The woods remained silent as I made my way out, with no wildlife sounds or signs of other curs, just an unsettling calm. It wasn't until I hit the fire road that normalcy returned. The sounds of cicadas and birds suddenly filled the air, as if nothing had happened. I got home just after 7. My mom asked about my hike and commented on my sun-touched cheeks. I brushed it off as a normal day, not wanting to delve into the unsettling experiences. It was only later that night, as I was deleting old photos from my phone, that I stumbled upon a video I didn't recognize. The thumbnail was dark and grainy, just an outline of trees with no timestamp. Curious, I tapped on it. The video was short, about 12 seconds, shaky, almost like it was recorded discreetly or by someone unfamiliar with how to use a camera. It showed me sleeping, and that's when I realized someone had indeed been there with me in the clearing. I found myself watching a video on my phone, shot from about 30 feet away in the tree line. I was lying on my side, arms tucked under my head, just as I remember waking up. The camera, held low to the ground, captured me in a fixed, slightly zoomed-in shot. The only sounds were the soft, uneven breaths that weren't mine. The video ended abruptly, cutting to black with no further movement or sound. I stared at it for 5 minutes straight, checking the details. No date, no time, no GPS tag, just a file number unlike any other in my videos folder. It was unsettling. This video shouldn't have been there. Everything else on my phone was normal. No weird files, no deleted apps, no signs of tampering. Yet, rewatching the video with the volume turned up confirmed the breathing sounds were real, soft but distinctly human, or close to it. That night, sleep eluded me. I kept checking my window and closet, making sure my phone was where I left it, too disturbed to share or delete the video. The next morning, I checked my backpack again. Everything was in place, no dirt, no scratches, and no signs of forced entry. The flashlight worked, and the zipper was fine. The presence of the video was no accident. I don't use cloud backups, and no one else has access to my phone. Considering it's always by my side, anyone attempting to record would have had to unlock it, film, save the file, relock the phone, and do all this without waking me, all within a few feet. After this incident, I stopped visiting that clearing and stuck to open trails, occasionally feeling the presence of someone not too far behind, just out of sight. Though I never found any other videos, the mysterious one disappeared a few months later. I hadn't deleted it, it was just gone. Despite running checks, searching every folder, and even connecting it to my laptop, I found nothing. It seemed to have deleted itself. But I remember everything, the image of me lying there, the trees barely moving in the background, and the breathing that sped up right before the video ended, as if whatever was filming me was drawing closer. I'd been sitting quietly in my old deer stand for about an hour, nestled about 12 feet up in a couple of thick maples, just off a barely used ATV trail. It was early November, and the chill in the air was sharper than I expected. The woods were silent, eerily still, with no wind or bird calls, just that ringing quiet that fills the air like a held breath. The sun had begun to set, casting a soft orange glow through the trees. This spot, slightly secluded and tucked away, always felt special. I hadn't really come to hunt, I just needed to escape, to find some peace in the quiet. Lately, sleep had been elusive, and something about the cold, enclosed space of the woods usually helped. I had cleared a few branches earlier in the season to improve my view, but otherwise left everything as it was. As I sat there, the stillness so profound, I began to nod off. It was during this half-asleep state that I noticed something odd moving through the trees to my right. Initially, it seemed like a low gray cloud, but it was too solid, too dark against the sky, and too low to be fog. It moved silently, without disturbing the leaves or branches, gliding smoothly as if floating. The shape was large and vague, the front rounded like the nose of a blimp, but darker. absorbing rather than reflecting the fading light. I sat up, holding my breath, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't a hang glider. There were no wings, no tail, and the forest was too dense for something like that to pass through unscathed. Yet, it moved with purpose, threading through the trees without touching them, adjusting its path ever so slightly. I watched, hardly blinking, as this massive, shadowy form passed about 50 yards from me, moving from right to left towards the deeper, hillier parts of the woods. It didn't feel natural, but it didn't feel threatening either. It seemed as if it belonged there in a way I didn't, a silent observer, or a passing shadow in the twilight of the woods. In the silence of the forest, I couldn't hear a thing. Usually, there's at least a soft whisper of wind rustling the branches, but this time, everything was eerily still, as if the forest was frozen in anticipation of something passing through. Even the birds had stopped their chatter. I was up in my stand, contemplating whether to follow the mysterious presence. However, my body wouldn't budge. It wasn't fear holding me back. It felt more like an instinctual knowledge that I shouldn't interfere. As the presence moved on, I noticed something unusual. Underneath it, there appeared to be a series of faint glowing lights. They were dim, resembling the fading embers of a dying fire, pulsing gently without any discernible pattern. These soft, reddish lights seemed to hover just below it, drifting along as it moved. Eventually, the shape and its lights began to fade, disappearing into the denser parts of the woods and slipping behind a ridge. I remained fixated on the spot where it vanished, half expecting it to reappear or soar upwards, but it simply continued on its path until it was completely out of sight. I didn't stir from my spot for what felt like an eternity, at least 20 minutes, gripping my rifle the entire time, though I never felt compelled to use it. The air felt colder, but my body didn't shiver. When I finally climbed down, my legs were heavy, as if I had been trekking all day. Checking my phone, I found no signal, a common occurrence out here, but the time displayed was 6:38. That was surprising. I could have sworn it was just past 5 when I first settled in the stand. Maybe I had dozed off for longer than I realized. The walk back to my truck was unsettling. The woods looked the same, but something was off. The spaces between the trees seemed wider, as if something large had moved through and then tried, unsuccessfully, to return everything to its original place. Arriving at my truck, I noticed the dome light was on, something I never leave on. The switch itself was flipped up, not set to automatic. That detail unnerved me more than anything. There were no footprints or signs of anyone else around, yet someone or something had been at my vehicle. Driving home, the signal returned a few miles down the road, and the clock hadn't changed abnormally, but my radio only emitted static, even on the stations that usually come in clear. I didn't mention any of this to my wife when I arrived home. I simply told her I had stayed out longer than intended. That night, my mind raced, replaying the day's strange events, but the answers seemed just as elusive as the fading light I had watched disappear into the forest. I was sitting on the porch just after 10, like most nights, enjoying the quiet with only the crickets for company. The air was still warm, clinging to the last bits of summer, and I hadn't even sipped the beer I'd opened. I was simply taking in the view of the tree line beyond my field. Living 15 minutes past town, into the hills, I relished the solitude. No neighbors, just my field and the woods beyond. That night, something caught my eye. An odd, solid orange light hovering low, about 20 feet off the ground over the field. It wasn't flickering or moving quickly like you'd expect from a drone, which was my first guess. Curious, I stood up to get a closer look. As I approached the edge of the porch, I noticed something eerie. The usual night sounds had vanished. No crickets, no frogs, not even the distant hoot of an owl. It was as if everything had been muted the moment I stepped forward. Days later, driven by an unshakable curiosity, I ventured back into the woods alone. Everything looked as it always had, the forest stand untouched. However, down the slope, a different scene unfolded. A huge tree, likely a century old, was leaning, its roots exposed on one side, as if something massive had brushed past without pausing or breaking its stride. There were no tracks. The ground was too dry and hard from the cold. Yet the underbrush showed signs of disturbance, thinner in a straight path toward the ridge. It was clear something had passed through. This experience lingered in my mind, not as a nightmare, but as a persistent vision behind my closed eyes. The shape, its smooth glide, how it seemed impossibly large for the dense woods, yet had moved without snapping a single twig. I've not returned since. Not out of fear, but from a sense that it wouldn't change anything. I saw what I saw, fully awake, and whatever it was, it either didn't want to be seen or simply didn't care. It felt like I wasn't meant to be there when it silently made its way through the forest. I was standing about 50 feet away from my house on the porch, just looking out at the field. There was this sphere, glowing orange, floating out there. It didn't light up the ground beneath it or anything. It just hung in the air, radiating a soft, ambient light. It was eerily quiet, so when I whispered, "Hey, anyone out there?" it felt like my voice was the only sound in existence. No one answered. I walked toward it, the dry grass crunching too sharply beneath my boots. As I got closer, keeping my eyes fixed on the sphere, it seemed to be about the size of a beach ball, maybe larger. There were no blinking lights, no sounds, no propellers, nothing that would suggest it was a drone or any identifiable flying object. When I reached a broken fence post, which I had never bothered to fix since deer could jump over it anyway, I leaned on it and noticed it was vibrating. It was a subtle, steady hum, like a cell phone on silent mode. Curiously, I lifted my hand and then placed it back on the post. It was still humming. Looking up, I noticed the sphere had moved slightly, just a few feet higher and to the left. I hadn't seen it move, it had just shifted positions quietly. That was enough for me. I began to back away, still watching the sphere. The air around me felt strange, neither warm nor cold, just neutral, as if all the energy had been sucked out of the atmosphere. I retreated back to the porch and just stood there, not daring to go inside. The sphere remained stationary, as if it were waiting for something. Then suddenly, I heard a noise from inside the house, like the creak of the floorboards that always groan right past the entryway. I spun around, half expecting to see the door open, but it was still firmly shut, all the lights off. I didn't venture in. Instead, I just stood there, hand on the doorknob, the other hand by my side, peering back at the field. But the sphere had disappeared. It hadn't faded or flown away. It was simply gone. The usual night sounds didn't return. Everything remained eerily silent. I stayed out on the porch for another 10 minutes before finally going back inside. I turned on every light and walked through the entire house, checking every door and window. Everything was just as it should be, nothing out of place. But the quiet remained. I saw it for the first time when I went out to feed Maisie, the dog, one morning before school. It was around 6:40 a.m., and I was already late, not even having had breakfast yet. Maisie was whining at the back door, eager to go out. When I opened the door and stepped onto the porch, there it was in the middle of the backyard, a perfect circle, about 12 feet across or maybe more. The grass inside the circle was gray and dead, not mowed or flattened, but burnt, as if scorched by something. The edges were unnaturally clean. I froze on the steps, just staring. Normally, Maisie would bolt straight to the fence, barking at anything or nothing, but that day she just stayed by my side, refusing to step off the porch. That night, something felt off. The air inside was colder than it should have been, as if the AC was on full blast, yet it was off. I ended up sleeping with the lights on. The next morning, curiosity got the better of me, and I walked out to the field to the spot where I had seen the circle. But there was nothing there. No burnt grass, no marks, no sign that anyone had been there. The only odd thing was the fence post I had leaned on the previous day. It was loose, as if it had been shaken from its base. There were also drag marks on one side, long scratches that were shallow but clean, like something smooth and hard had brushed against it. 2 nights later, I found myself on the porch again, out of habit, beer in hand. The air felt normal, and the crickets were chirping again. Then my phone buzzed with a notification, a rare occurrence since I usually got no service out here. It was a motion alert from the camera mounted above my front door. This old model doesn't stream live. It just records clips and sends alerts. Curious, I checked the app. The clip was only 5 seconds long, pitch black and showing nothing visible, but the audio picked up something odd. Not footsteps or animal sounds, but a low vibration, almost like it came from the walls themselves. Then it stopped abruptly. After that, there were no more alerts, nothing else on the camera. Following that night, I stayed indoors for a week, especially at night, and kept the porch light on continuously. I didn't see or hear anything unusual, no lights, no sounds, but I made it a routine to check the field every morning. Sometimes the post was leaning just slightly, as if it had been touched or remembered. I never told anyone about these incidents. What was I supposed to say? I felt a strange sensation in my stomach as I stared at the circle in our yard. It seemed like a prank, or perhaps a chemical spill, but there was no smell of gas or burnt plastic, nothing at all. The grass within the circle was brittle, resembling ash, yet it didn't crumble when I touched it. It felt dry and stiff, almost artificial. Curious, I called my mom, who was in the kitchen. "Come out here. There's something in the yard," I shouted to her through the screen door. She peered out, puzzled, then joined me outside, her coffee forgotten. "Was this here yesterday?" I asked. She shook her head, clearly troubled. "No, I would have noticed this. Did you do something out here last night?" I assured her I hadn't stepped outside since dinner. My dad joined us shortly, hands in his jacket pockets, and circled the strange patch silently, his face etched with annoyance. "Maybe somebody sprayed something or dumped something over the fence," he suggested. He inspected the fence line for any clue, a bucket or any sign of tampering, but found nothing except the usual pine needles and leaves from the neighbor's yard. The rest of the day, I couldn't shake off the image of the circle. It was peculiar, perfectly shaped, with no draw, G-marks, footprints, or tire tracks nearby. It seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. That evening, equipped with a flashlight, I examined the circle closely, hoping to find an oil sheen or something clinging to the grass blades, but there was nothing. My dog, Maisie, kept her distance, unnerved by the patch. By the next morning, the grass looked even grayer, as if the color was leaching out. When I tried to break off a piece, it just crumbled in my fingers like dry paint. I took some photos with my phone, but they were disappointingly mundane. The oddity of the situation didn't translate through the lens. It just looked like a patch of dead grass, unless you knew it hadn't been there the day before. Thursday brought another odd discovery. The circle felt noticeably colder than its surroundings. I didn't have a thermometer, but the air above it was definitely chillier, a difference you could feel if you lingered there. By Friday night, my curiosity had turned into an obsession. I stayed up late, sitting in my room, watching the backyard through slightly parted blinds, half expecting to see something, anything, that might explain the mysterious circle. Around 2:30 a.m., I spotted a quick glow at the far end of the yard by the fence. It vanished before I could get a better look. Unlike a flashlight or porch light, it was an orange glow closer to the ground. The night was eerily silent as I stepped outside to investigate. I walked over to the spot but found nothing unusual. The grass looked normal, and only the original circle remained. My dog Maisie came with me, sticking close but anxiously staring toward the woods, her ears back, silent. The following Saturday morning, we discovered a new circle, smaller, about 6 feet across, near the fence corner. It looked just like the first, perfectly round with the same brittle grass. This discovery unsettled my mom. She sent pictures to my uncle, who had experience in turf work. He suggested it might be a fungus or a fairy ring, but he was puzzled by the perfect symmetry and the dead grass, which isn't typical for those natural occurrences. Concerned, my dad decided to install security cameras and bought a motion-activated light for the porch. That night, I left my window slightly open. I woke up abruptly at 1:40 a.m. for no apparent reason. At first, all was quiet, but then Maisie barked sharply a couple of times and fell silent. Her bark sounded alarmed, different from usual. When I checked outside, the yard seemed normal, but the shadows were off. The big pine tree's shadow was cast in the wrong direction, as if there was another light source behind it on the ground, though I saw nothing. I watched, holding my breath, trying to understand. After a tense minute, the shadows returned to normal, and Maisie whined lowly, sounding bewildered rather than scared. I stepped outside again. The night was still, but the air had a metallic scent, similar to the taste of a penny. By morning, the strange smell had dissipated. We didn't find any more circles, but the 2 that appeared remained over a month, the grass never regrowing, even after rain. Eventually, my dad removed the dead patches, replacing them with new soil and seed. Despite his efforts, those spots still look different, the color never quite matching the rest of the lawn. Every now and then, I have this dream where I'm looking out at the backyard. In the dream, the circles on the grass glow just enough to be visible from the window. But when I go outside, it's pitch black, as if the light vanishes when I approach. In waking life, nothing out of the ordinary has really happened, but I still find myself checking the grass every now and then, especially after it rains. I remember one particular morning, late in the fall. It was still dark out just before sunrise, around 5:45 a.m. I was out for a run, trying to stick to a new habit of running 3 miles before work. It was my 3rd week into this routine. The air was chilly, colder than usual, and I could see my breath puffing out in little clouds. My phone showed it was 38 degrees. I was dressed warmly, with gloves and a fleece headband over my ears. My usual route takes me through residential streets, past a small park, and then along a service road next to a field. It's pretty deserted at that hour, maybe a jogger or a dog walker if it's a bit later, but I was alone that day. Just as I was hitting the straight stretch by the field, something caught my eye. I was listening to a podcast, but I looked up, maybe because I saw a flicker of movement. It was a commercial jet, far off in the distance, flying from east to west. We're under a flight path, so seeing planes is nothing new. But this one seemed odd because it appeared not to be moving. At first, I thought it was just the angle. Sometimes planes look like they're hovering if they're coming towards you or moving away in a straight line. But this plane was sideways, not facing me. I could clearly make out its shape and the blinking lights on the wings. I kept jogging, watching the plane, but it stayed frozen above the tree line. After about 100 feet, I stopped, took out my earbuds, and just stared. I'm not sure how long I stood there, maybe a minute or two, but the longer the plane stayed motionless, the stranger it felt. It just didn't make any sense. Planes don't just hover, and certainly not that high up. Helicopters can hover, but not like that. I looked around. The road was empty, no traffic, nobody around, just me and this still, silent plane in the sky. I checked my phone again, half expecting the time to have stood still too, but everything else was normal. At 5:52 a.m., I checked my phone, not sure what I expected, but needing something familiar to anchor me. When I looked up, the object was still hanging there unchanged. Initially, I thought it might be a blimp, like the ones we occasionally see at football games, but those are lower, slower, and clearly identifiable. This thing, shaped distinctly like a jet, but completely silent, was different. All I could hear was a distant dog barking across the field. Compelled by curiosity, I started moving forward slowly, keeping my gaze fixed on the object. My mind scrambled for a logical explanation, but nothing fit. Then, as if someone had pressed play, it resumed moving smoothly westward at a typical commercial plane speed. It didn't accelerate or wobble. There was no sound of an engine powering up. It just moved as if it had never stopped. I glanced at my phone again. It was 5:57 a.m. The object had been motionless for nearly 5 minutes, but once it started moving again, it seemed completely normal. I watched it until it vanished behind some clouds. For the rest of my run, I couldn't help but look up every few seconds, half expecting to see it, or another one, frozen in the sky again. But everything else appeared normal. I didn't mention the incident to my girlfriend or anyone at work. How could I explain it without sounding crazy? That night, I scoured the internet for any reports, flight tracking sites, local news, even Twitter, to see if anyone else had noticed anything unusual. Nothing turned up. I couldn't shake off the eerie stillness of the object. It felt as though it wasn't just motionless, but frozen out of time, while the world continued around it. 2 days later, I returned to the same spot at the same time. It was cloudy, with no planes in sight. I repeated the loop every day that week, but nothing out of the ordinary happened again. I've kept the story to myself since then, without any evidence to show, just those strange, still 5 minutes when something didn't behave as it should. Now and then, when I'm out early and spot a plane, I pause to make sure it's actually moving. As the sun was setting, we found ourselves pulling off the highway onto a gravel turnout, not an official rest stop. just a wide shoulder with a solitary trash barrel and endless stretches of desert in every direction. We had been on the road since early morning, making the long trek from California to Utah in hopes of reaching our family in one day. By the time we stopped, it was around 4:30 or 5 p.m., and none of us had stepped out of the car for hours. Stepping out into the dry desert heat, which hit like a blast from an oven, I remember the absolute silence. No wind, no insects, just a buzzing that you hear when everything else is mute. My sister immediately took off to find a spot to pee while I headed to the trunk to grab some Gatorades. Nearby, Dad was taking a smoking break, and Mom paced around the car, phone in hand, searching for a signal. Suddenly, the car alarm shattered the silence, a sharp, jarring sound that made us all jump. Dad quickly fumbled with the key fob, pressing the unlock button a few times to silence it. We exchanged bewildered glances, wondering what could have set it off. Dad speculated that the heat might have affected the car's electronic systems, considering we'd had issues with the automatic locks before, but nothing quite like this. After the brief interruption, we gathered ourselves. I climbed back into the car with my sister, and soon after, my parents finished their drinks and we were back on the road. It was then that we noticed the dash cam had reset itself. The little Garmin, always recording on a loop, was now dark, its screen off, and the timestamp reset to January 1st, 2018 at 12 a.m. Dad tried restarting it while driving, and it flickered back to life, but with the incorrect date and time. We chalked it up to the heat affecting it as well, and didn't think much of it until later. That evening, when we stopped at a hotel in Cedar City, Dad connected the dash cam to his laptop to dump the files, a routine he followed after long drives. We were all a bit puzzled by the day's odd occurrences, but were too tired to give it much thought. We were just relieved to stretch our legs and have a break from the road. I was just chilling on the bed, half glued to the TV when Dad called me over to check out something weird on the dash cam. We had parked the car earlier, and everything seemed normal at first glance. No movement, the engine was off, just the car sitting there. You could hear a bit of gravel crunching underfoot, probably Dad, and some wind in the background. Then out of nowhere, the car's interior lit up for a second. It wasn't the dome light. The whole inside of the car just flashed white. Then everything went dark again. It was bizarre because it looked darker outside than I remembered, like it was suddenly overcast, though the sky had been clear. A few moments later, another flash happened, fainter this time. If you squinted, you could see something odd reflected in the windshield. Dim, circular lights, maybe 3 or 4, moving slowly across from left to right. They weren't like any headlights I'd seen, too high and too slow, and they didn't blink like plane lights either, just soft, pale glows. Right after that, the car alarm blared, the audio went crazy loud and distorted, and the dashcam feed glitched and cut out. The next clip only started recording once we were driving again. Dad replayed the footage several times, trying to zoom in and adjust the contrast, but the video quality was too poor to see the details clearly, just those strange, faint circles overhead. The weirdest thing? None of us remembered seeing any lights or hearing the car alarm at the time, not even out of the corner of our eyes. We even asked each other if anyone had noticed anything unusual. Nothing. Curious, I looked up where we had stopped that night. It was pretty isolated, just desert, with a couple of old mining roads, and no towns for miles around near Tonopah. I tried finding reports of weird occurrences in the area, but all I got were stories about Area 51, which was way farther south. The next day, the car and the dashcam were both back to normal, as if nothing had happened. We finished our trip, stayed with my uncle for a few days, and then headed home without stopping near that spot again. A couple of weeks later, back at home, I asked Dad if he still had that clip. Turns out, it must have gotten deleted when the dashcam overwrote the old files. It was a chilly, mid-November morning, just a little after 6 a.m. when I got into work. Even with the heater on, you could see your breath inside the truck. I've been working at this substation for nearly 12 years, following the same daily routine. Walk the perimeter, check the cameras, go over the overnight logs, and then tackle the daily checklist. That day, something unusual happened. A fence alarm went off at precisely 2:17 a.m. It wasn't a full breach, just a trigger from the west corner sensor. Often it's just the deer or a strong gust of wind, but we still have to follow protocol, check the footage, and log the incident. I headed to the security office to review the video. Our setup includes 6 cameras covering the outer fence and 2 inside the yard. They record all night and flag any activity that matches an alarm or motion trigger. I pulled up the timeline for camera 4, positioned at the west corner. Everything appeared normal until 2:16:38, when suddenly the screen just went black. No static, no interference, nothing. It was like someone put a lens cap on the camera. This blackout lasted exactly 18 minutes. At 2:34:39, the video feed abruptly returned, as though nothing had happened. There was no damage to the camera, no power loss, and oddest of all, the log showed no interruption, just continuous recording as if everything was fine. Curious, I checked the footage from camera 2, which offers a slightly different view of the same area. It was functioning the entire time, but during those same 18 minutes, it recorded only still frames. There was no movement, no wind, no flickering, like time had stopped in the yard. Then I turned to camera 6, mounted high on the east tower and overlooking the main transformer. As I scrubbed through the same time frame, I caught something bizarre that made my stomach turn. At 2:26 a.m., for just a single frame, there appeared a bright oval shape, blurred around the edges and hovering about 15 feet above the transformer. It was silent, cast no shadow, and resembled a spotlight shining through fog, but without a visible beam. It looked more like a smear of light with a soft white core. When I tried to zoom in, the image just pixelated, offering no distinct features or markings. Despite his claim of not being great with computers, he certainly knows enough to regularly back up his data. I sometimes think about pulling over again, just stopping in the middle of nowhere to see if anything unusual happens again. But I never do. The day started off like any other, but things took a strange turn when the fence alarm went off for no apparent reason. I checked the security cameras and noticed that camera 4 had skipped recording for a bit. When I looked at the footage frame by frame, there was one frame that caught my eye. It showed a slightly flattened oval shape, tilted as if it was angling toward the fence. In the next frame, it was gone, and everything looked normal again. I called my supervisor, reported the alarm and the gap in the recording, but didn't mention the odd frame. He instructed me to log the incident, do a visual inspection, and keep an eye out for anything unusual. I saved that peculiar frame separately on a flash drive. Upon inspecting the site, the transformer showed no signs of damage or unusual heat, and the voltage readings were normal. However, I noticed a subtle dent in the gravel near the transformer, as if the rocks had been pushed outward from the center. It wasn't obvious, something you'd only spot if you were looking for it. Inside the control building, all the clocks were in sync, except for one wall unit, which was running 7 minutes fast. I reset it, but after lunch, it was fast again by exactly 7 minutes, untouched by anyone else. The rest of the day, the cameras functioned normally, but I couldn't shake off a feeling of unease. I kept revisiting that section of the footage. Every review showed the same thing, a blackout from 2:16 to 2:34 a.m., with that one odd frame in the middle. I tried enhancing the image, running filters, even sending a still to a friend skilled in photo editing. He suggested it looked like a long exposure blur, but couldn't explain how it appeared in just one frame, especially since the camera logs showed no change in exposure settings. That night, I hardly slept, not out of fear, but a nagging sense that something had occurred right under our noses, something we weren't meant to notice. The next shift, I arrived early to delve into the scatter system's raw logs. They matched up with the footage, no power drops or voltage spikes, except for a brief, unexplained zero load reading on the main switchgear at 2:19 a.m. that lasted about 2 seconds. It wasn't enough to set off an alarm, just a sudden dip to nothing and then back to normal. Curious, I checked the grounding logs for the neutral line and found the same brief zero reading. I kept these findings out of the official log, uneasy about drawing attention to them without more to go on. 3 days later, I discussed these anomalies with one of the guys. Last week, someone from the night shift told me they heard a weird humming noise outside. It was like a giant transformer starting up, but lasted just a few seconds. The sound was deep and drawn out. At the time, he didn't think it was a big deal, and no one else mentioned hearing it. Then, a week later, camera 4 just stopped working out of the blue. When we checked it out, we found the internal board was completely fried, like it had melted from the inside. The housing was sealed tight, with no signs anyone had messed with it or any weather damage. It looked like it just cooked itself. Everything else in the system was working fine. I showed the camera frame to a maintenance guy I trust, and he couldn't explain it either. He just said, whatever that is, it wasn't from here, and he didn't mean it wasn't from around here. I still work there, and we've replaced and upgraded all the cameras. Everything's running smoothly now, but I always check that spot first thing when I'm on a shift. Nothing odd has happened since. On a separate note, I was flying a Cessna 182 from Salt Lake City to Winnemucca. It was just a personal trip, nothing official. I've flown this route loads of times. The plane is old, but in good shape. That night, the air was calm and clear, perfect for flying. It was around 10:15 p.m., still early in the flight, and the moon was barely up. I was cruising at 9,500 feet, everything stable, and I wasn't expecting any surprises. About 25 minutes from the Nevada line, I saw something odd out of the corner of my eye to the right. At first, I thought it was just a ground light, maybe from a ranch or a vehicle, but it seemed too high up. When I looked closer, I saw 3 dim white lights in a vertical line about 10 or 15 miles away. They were slowly rising straight up, not moving across the sky. They weren't stars. They were too low, and the spacing between them didn't change even when I changed my viewing angle. I checked my map light and looked at the chart, but there was nothing there. No towers, no airfields, no controlled airspace. I radioed the Salt Lake Center to see if they noticed anything on their radar where I saw the lights. After a brief pause, they responded that my plane was the only thing on radar in that sector and asked me to confirm the direction of the lights. I told them it was at 10 from my position, slightly off by about 15 degrees. They first told me there was no traffic, civilian or otherwise, within a 50-mile radius. That's when a strange feeling started to creep in. I wasn't scared, but something was definitely off. I wasn't supposed to be witnessing what was unfolding before me. I watched as 3 steady, dim white lights, which were not blinking or strobing like typical aircraft lights, slowly ascended. Then, a 4th light joined them, emerging faintly before becoming as solid as the others. I reached out to the control center again. Salt Lake, are you sure there are no towers or weather balloons out here? These lights are bright and they're climbing. The response was clear. Negative, Mike Romeo. There's nothing scheduled in that region tonight. No weather balloons, no launches. Do you want to divert? I didn't reply immediately, still fixated on the lights. They had stopped their ascent and were now hovering about 5,000 feet above, too high for towers, yet too low and too still to be stars. Curious, I adjusted my course slightly to the right to maintain a better view. Instantly, the whole group shifted sideways, moving as a single column to the west, smoothly as if sliding on glass. They maintained their formation without any change in spacing or rotation. Salt Lake, I've got visual contact with 4 unidentified lights moving laterally. No strobes, no sound, no visible aircraft body. Are you sure I'm the only one out here? After a longer pause this time, the reply came. 785 Mike Romeo, we only show you in that airspace. Do you wish to declare any kind of emergency? I simply responded, no, and continued to observe. The lights maintained their position for a minute more before they suddenly began to rise again, this time much faster. They soared straight up and vanished into the cloudless night sky in about 3 seconds. It was as if they were never there, leaving behind nothing but the empty sky. I kept staring at where they had been, but the center remained silent, probably waiting to see if I would report anything further. I didn't. The rest of the flight passed by quietly. I landed just after 11:30. The wind was calm, the hangar dark, and there was no one around. After tying down the plane, I got into my truck and left, still processing what I had just experienced. I headed to the motel with only a few essentials, figuring I'd unpack later. The next morning, I noticed some unusual things. My solar Casio watch, which is usually accurate, was running 10 minutes slow. My backup headset mic had somehow partly unplugged itself and was tucked under the seat. Also, my kneeboard, which I always attach to my leg during flights, ended up on the passenger side floor. These weren't earth-shattering changes, but they were odd because I distinctly remember checking the time before seeing some strange lights, securing the kneeboard to my knee, and coiling my headset cord as I always do. Something had definitely shifted overnight. I've only shared these details with another pilot, someone I trust. He didn't laugh or dismiss my story. He just listened, nodded, and mentioned he'd also seen strange lights over that area more than once. I've avoided flying that route at night ever since. That week, the aurora was particularly vibrant, easily visible from our backyard, but I wanted a clearer, unobstructed view. So around 11:30, we drove past the tree line, aiming to escape the town's ambient light. We took the old Forest Service road that runs parallel to the river. I was familiar with it in the summer, but it was my first time navigating it in winter. Although snow, packed and narrow, the Jeep managed well. We parked in a small pull-off area about half a mile beyond the last marker. It seemed we were the only ones out there. No other tire tracks, no headlights. It was serene, just the wind whispering through the trees and our footsteps crunching in the snow. By the time we settled in with our folding chairs and a thermos of tea, the sky was already alive with color, mostly green bands edged with pink. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary, just the typical slow dance of lights across the stars. We sat there in silence for about 20 minutes, simply taking in the beauty of the scene. Despite the cold, it felt perfect, everything still and just right. Then, something unusual happened with the aurora. One of the green bands intensified, which isn't uncommon due to spikes in solar activity. But instead of the usual fade or shift, this band began to split. It started at the center, pinching inward as if being tugged from both ends. Slowly, the two halves spiraled apart, forming a tight, slow spiral like a drill bit in motion. The other bands continued their normal flow, unaffected, but this spiral stayed fixed, unlike anything I'd seen before. Hovering right above us, it was silent, just a green spiral rotating in the same spot. It didn't make a sound, and there were no sudden flashes. It was slowly spinning, almost like a corkscrew tightening and collapsing inward. My girlfriend and I were quiet for a while, just watching it. I first thought it might be a trick of the eye, so I looked away and then back, but it was still there. She asked if I saw it too, and I confirmed. Then, suddenly, it disappeared as if someone had flipped a switch. 1 second it was there, the next it wasn't. The rest of the aurora continued as if nothing had happened. The air felt different after that. It wasn't colder, but it felt heavier, like the pressure had changed. This wasn't something you felt in your ears, but more in your chest, similar to how it feels before a storm, but there was no wind. We both sensed that something was off, really off, though neither of us wanted to say it out loud. After a few more minutes, the atmosphere didn't feel right, and we decided to leave. By then, the tea had gone cold, and the thermos had even frozen to the armrest of her chair. We packed up and got back in the car. The drive back felt longer. The trees looked the same, but something about their spacing felt wrong. I kept expecting to see our turnoff, but it never came. I wondered if I had taken a wrong turn, but the road was a straight shot. There was no way to get lost unless you were trying. I checked the time. It was 1:12 a.m. We should have been back on the main road by then. It had only been about 20 minutes when we drove out, but we were still crawling down the forest road, and the trees seemed like they were closing in a little. I asked her what time she had, and her phone read 12:39. We both had the same carrier, same phones, but we were 33 minutes apart. She refused to restart her phone, which scared me a bit since she's usually the practical one. A few minutes later, I noticed lights through the trees on our left. They weren't headlights, but something higher. At first, I thought they were just stars, but they didn't flicker. There were 3 of them, evenly spaced, hovering behind the trees, white and not blinking. We passed them slowly, but I couldn't make out any shape between them, just black space and those 3 dots. Neither of us said anything until she finally asked if I saw them, and I simply kept driving. When we finally hit pavement again, our phones did something strange. Hers jumped forward by 34 minutes, while mine stayed the same. The signal bars flickered, then returned to full strength. My car clock agreed with my phone, but hers lagged behind for some reason. We rolled into our driveway at 1:04, 5 a.m. Our dog was right there waiting at the door, which is normal, but she didn't bark or run around like she usually does when we get home late. She just sat there, ears low, looking a bit off. Out of curiosity, we checked the weather radar online. Clear skies all night, no aurora spikes or anything else unusual. I tried to look up something about time drift on phones to explain what happened, but nothing seemed to fit our situation. The GPS logs added another layer of weirdness. Mine tracked consistently, but hers had a gap. It stopped recording at 12:12 a.m. and didn't start again until 1:18 a.m. There was no signal loss or low battery issue reported. For the next few days, she kept mentioning that the light in the morning seemed wrong. The sun felt off to her. Initially, I didn't see it, but then I started noticing it too. The shadows in our backyard looked sharper, as if the light was coming from a slightly different angle than usual. It was subtle, but definitely there. A few weeks later, I tried to recreate the drive, aiming to see if anything unusual happened again. It was the same time, the same route. The aurora was weaker that night, and everything on the drive seemed normal. The drive took exactly as long as it should, and our phones stayed in sync. No mysterious lights, nothing. We haven't been back since. That night, the spiral in the sky, it split from the center and spun in a way that felt unnatural, controlled somehow. It didn't seem like wind or magnetism or anything else I could easily describe. It felt like it was being pulled by something. I don't have the right words for it, and I'm not sure I should even try to explain. Some things just don't fit. That's what keeps bothering me. That morning, I woke up around 6:15 because the dog was pacing around, something she does when there's a raccoon outside or if something small moves around in the yard. Her nails clicking against the floor is annoying enough to wake me. I figured I'd let her out early and then head back to bed. I made myself a coffee and watched her sniff around near the sliding door, tail stiff, ears up. It was still that blue-gray early morning light just before sunrise. When I opened the door and stepped out behind her, barefoot with my mug in hand, that's when I noticed it. The grass looked darker, not wet or shadowed, just wrong. It wasn't everywhere, just in patches, adding to the morning's unease. In the middle of the lawn, stretching toward the fence, there was a big patch, about 12 by 12 feet, that looked like soot under the porch light, fine and black like powder. At first, I thought it was ash, since we've had wildfires before, and sometimes ash travels far. But this was different. It wasn't floating down. It had already settled. When I got closer, it seemed like it had been evenly sifted across the grass. No wind streaks or clumps, just a smooth layer as if someone had laid down a tarp of powder and then peeled it off perfectly. Curious, I touched it. It was a little dry and stuck to my fingertips, almost like graphite dust, but there was no smell. My dog, usually curious, just stayed on the porch, tail low, staring at the patch. She wouldn't come when I called her, and eventually went back inside. I stood there, a bit puzzled. It didn't seem dangerous, just weird. I looked up at the sky for any signs of smoke or a jet trail, but it was clear, cold, and still. I took a few pictures with my phone, although the flash washed out the details a bit. You could still see the color shift. I sent one to my neighbor Marcy, who's always keen on neighborhood anomalies like drones and power outages. It was early, around 8:30, and she didn't reply. When I went out later to take another look, the stuff had vanished. Not blown away or washed away by rain. There hadn't been any rain, and not a breath of wind. It was gone as if it had been vacuumed up, gror, ass and all. The lawn looked normal, maybe even cleaner than usual. No streaks, no damp spots, not even my footprints. What really got me was the porch steps. I had walked on them barefoot before and had seen a couple of dark smudges on the top step, but now they were gone too. I went back inside and checked the floor. No grit, no trail. I had planned to clean it up later, but it was as if I had never touched the stuff. I started to wonder if I had imagined the whole scene, but the photos on my phone were real, time-stamped, showing the same yard and the same patch clearly visible. It was baffling. I could have walked someone out there an hour later, and there would have been nothing to show. My dog still refused to go outside, adding to the eerie feeling that something unexplainable had just occurred. That day, she mostly stayed by the door, occasionally peeking out, but never leaving. Every time I opened it, she backed away from the threshold. One time, I tried to carry her outside, but she wriggled free from my grasp the moment we stepped out and dashed back indoors. Around noon, I phoned Marcy to see if she'd noticed anything odd since her yard adjoins ours. She hadn't seen anything unusual, though she mentioned her dog was also acting differently, showing little energy and avoiding the back fence. I only shared that I found some strange black substance on my lawn that morning, thinking perhaps it had come from her yard. She speculated it might be from a tree or just mold, but she didn't seem convinced. For the rest of the day, I avoided the backyard, just tending to my front garden and staying inside. I kept an eye on the grass from inside, half expecting to see a change or something return, but nothing happened. It looked utterly normal. That evening, instead of her usual routine of exploring the lawn, my dog refused to even look towards the porch. I ended up taking her for a walk down the block. Later, standing on the back steps in the dark, I listened to the eerie silence of the yard. No insects, no crickets, nothing. It was unsettlingly quiet, as if everything had been muted. The quiet lingered for days. The grass stayed the same, no new growth, no odd colors, no smells, or dead patches. But the dog kept her distance. Even a week later, she would only peek outside if I left the door open, then choose to lie down elsewhere. Whatever had happened, or whatever had been there, remained a mystery, but it was clear she remembered something. We were on a sailing trip, a few hours away from the coast, heading west. It was around 2 a.m., with a clear sky and stars all around, almost windless. I was alone on deck, keeping watch while Eric and Darren slept. We took turns watching as we sailed overnight. The boat, a 38-foot sloop, wasn't luxurious but sturdy, entrusted to us by a friend of Darren's. We were just doing him a favor by moving it down the coast. Working the midnight to 4 a.m. shift was usually pretty calm for me. Nights out there had their own kind of peacefulness, even though they were quiet and you might feel a bit sleepy. The regular sounds, the water slapping against the hull, the rigging creaking, the little groans from the fiberglass, became something you just got used to. One night, while I was sitting near the helm and sipping cold coffee from my thermos, I was just zoning out, but still kept an eye on the water, like I was supposed to. Suddenly, I caught a faint glow under the surface off the port side. Initially, I thought it was just bioluminescence, which isn't unusual, especially when plankton gets stirred up by the boat's wake. But this light was different. It was a steady, pale green, almost bluish glow that didn't move with the water. It wasn't flashing or sparkling, it was just there. Curious, I leaned over the rail and squinted to see better. The glow seemed deep, and I couldn't make out any shape, but it was clearly there. 3 identical orbs of light, perfectly spaced about 20 feet apart, forming a straight line parallel to the boat. They seemed to be moving with us. I watched these lights for about 30 seconds, trying to make sense of them. Were they a reflection? Some kind of underwater buoy? They definitely weren't floating on the surface. My guess was they were around 15 or 20 feet underwater. Deciding to investigate further, I grabbed the handheld spotlight we kept at the helm and aimed it toward the water. The moment the beam hit the glowing orbs, they reacted. All 3 lights dropped deeper in perfect sync, disappearing straight down like they were being pulled on a string. There was no delay, no hesitation. They were just gone. It all happened so fast, I almost thought I had imagined it, but I knew I hadn't. I stood there, holding the light over the side, scanning back and forth in the water, waiting for something, anything to reappear. After about 5 minutes, I turned off the spotlight. The boat was still creaking, the rope still clinking against the mast. Nothing out of the ordinary, yet the air felt heavier. I found myself holding my breath without even realizing it. I can't recall sitting back down. I just remember feeling like I shouldn't take my eyes off the water. About 15 minutes later, I noticed something again. It wasn't lights this time, but a movement behind the boat, about 50 yards back. There was a disturbance on the surface, not a wave or caused by the wind, but just a wide, smooth bulge of water, rising just enough to create a ripple. I was on watch duty that night on the boat, and something strange caught my eye, a light that rolled once and then vanished. I just watched, not really thinking about anything, and I chose not to wake the others. Even though I considered investigating further, I didn't. The rest of my watch passed without any more odd occurrences. When Eric took over around 4 a.m., I mentioned the lights to him, but he shrugged it off, suggesting it might have been a school of squid. The following day, we docked at the harbor around noon without any issues. That evening, back on solid ground, I brought up the lights again, this time more earnestly. Darren reacted surprisingly, admitting he had seen something similar a few years back, while sailing off the Gulf. 3 underwater lights moving in sync. He had kept it to himself, thinking no one would believe him. We didn't discuss it much after that, but I couldn't shake off the precision of the lights' arrangement, how quickly they disappeared when illuminated, and the unnatural way the water moved around them. It didn't seem like anything natural. It felt like it wasn't supposed to be seen. Meanwhile, at the nature preserve where I work, part of my job involves checking trail cameras set up to monitor wildlife and occasionally people who stray from the paths. These cameras, fixed to trees, are nothing elaborate, just devices triggered by motion that record short clips. One morning, while reviewing footage over coffee, I noticed something unusual in a video recorded just after midnight. The camera at the far end of the preserve, near an old clearing surrounded by dense pines, captured typical nighttime scenes until a tall, thin figure appeared at the frame's edge. It stood about 7 feet tall and looked like it could be just a skeleton wrapped in dark material, though it was hard to tell if it was wearing clothes or if it was its skin. The figure stood eerily still, staring directly into the camera, making it hard to discern any facial features. I was watching some footage from a camera we have set up in a nature preserve, and I noticed something strange. A shadowy figure that stood completely still. It was just the outline of a head and shoulders, no features like eyes or a mouth, just a dark shape. Normally, the camera captures all sorts of movement, animals, wind in the leaves, branches swaying. But this figure? It didn't budge, not even a little, for almost 10 seconds. Then it just vanished from the frame. I must have watched that clip over and over again, trying to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe just a play of light or an oddly shaped branch. But the shape was too clear, too intentional. I had to see it for myself. So that evening, I grabbed my flashlight and phone and headed out to the preserve. It's a big place, and the camera was a good mile away from the main ranger station. I planned my hike so I'd get to the clearing around 10 p.m. The walk there was pretty uneventful, just the normal sounds of crickets and owls and the chilly air of early fall. I half expected to see something odd along the trail, something like what was in the footage. When I reached the clearing, I stopped right at the edge where the camera had been pointing. It was just as I'd seen in the video, dark and quiet, with only the stars peeking through the gaps in the trees. I started to search the area with my flashlight, looking for any signs, footprints, anything that might give away what that figure was. But there was nothing, no tracks of any kind. Then I noticed something odd about the leaves where the figure had stood. The ground looked scorched, as if something hot had been pressed against it. The marks were shallow, forming a rough oval about 6 feet across. The leaves were brown and brittle, but there wasn't any ash or smell of smoke, just this weird singed appearance. I walked around the clearing, flashlight in hand, scanning every direction. The only sounds were the crunch of dry leaves under my feet and the occasional snap of a twig deeper in the woods. I felt uneasy, a tight knot in my chest, but I kept telling myself it was just the cold or my nerves. I stayed there for about 20 minutes, watching and listening, but nothing more happened. There were no movements, no odd sounds, and no mysterious lights. Just a quiet night under a steady sky of stars. On the way back, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen, the tall, still figure and the scorched leaves, but no footprints. It just didn't make sense. That night, back at home, I tried calling Gray. After noticing some odd scorched marks on leaves and no footprints in a clearing, I asked a few coworkers if they had seen anything unusual. They hadn't, and one even joked about it being a ghost, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more real. I returned to the clearing several times, but nothing had changed. The marks were the same, and the ground still showed no signs of disturbance. Curious, I set up another camera closer to the spot, hoping to capture whatever it was again. A week went by with nothing showing up on the new camera. However, one night, while reviewing footage from a different camera, I caught sight of something strange again. It was a dim, slowly moving light between the trees, pulsing faintly and not making any sound. It wasn't like any flashlight or anything recognizable. I tried zooming in on the footage, but the quality was too low to discern any specific shapes. The light would disappear behind tree trunks and then reappear yards away. Something was off with the timestamps too. The light showed up for a minute or two, then the camera would stop recording for a few minutes and start again. It seemed like something was interfering with the camera. Despite this, I decided against turning off the cameras. I needed to know more. That same night, staying late at the ranger station, I listened for unusual sounds, but only heard the typical night noises. Peering out the window, I saw a faint, bluish-white glow at the edge of the tree line, right where the first figure had appeared. It was almost like light filtering through fog. I rushed outside with a flashlight, but as I approached, the glow vanished. I've returned to that clearing several times since, but neither the figure nor the glow has reappeared. The only evidence remaining is the inexplicable scorched leaves. I keep replaying the footage, pondering over the marks and the strange lights, but can't figure out what happened or why. Part of me is afraid that digging deeper might reveal something I'm not prepared to face. Yet, the footage and those scorched leaves are undeniable. Some mysteries might just prefer to stay unsolved. Later that night, back home and relaxing on the couch, I was scrolling through my phone when I noticed a voicemail notification. It was from an unknown number, something I didn't even realize until then. I remember clearly because I had been at the dentist that day, and I turned my phone off before the cleaning. My phone was completely off, not just on silent, from before 2 p.m. I had been receiving non-stop spam calls and just wanted a break from it. It stayed off, tucked away in my purse, until around 5 p.m. when I powered it back on. That's when I noticed the notification for a voicemail that supposedly came through at 2:41 p.m. At first, I thought it was a glitch, or perhaps the timestamp was wrong, as cell towers can act up. Curious, I hit play on the voicemail. It started with static, soft, and faint, like an untuned radio. Then, I heard what seemed like a breath, followed by my name being whispered, drawn out and close to the microphone. It sounded like my voice, not exactly, but close, with a slight rasp that I sometimes have when I'm tired or my allergies flare up. The message featured this wind sound, not fluctuating like real wind, but constant, almost like background noise. The whole thing lasted about 9 seconds, just static, a whisper, and that wind. Shaken, I played it again, this time turning the volume all the way up. The part where my name, Rachel, was mentioned wasn't even a full sentence, just barely audible, as if whispered directly against the phone and then trailing off into the wind sound. I checked my call log, and it just showed unknown at 2:41 p.m., incoming. Strangely, the voicemail didn't appear in the visual transcript, which usually auto-transcribes messages. It just said, unable to transcribe message. I tried calling my own number from a landline to check if everything was normal. It rang through to my voicemail without any issues. I even forwarded the message to myself and attempted to play it on my laptop, hoping to run it through some filters to hear it more clearly. However, the file was unreadable, showing up as a 0-byte attachment, as if it didn't exist. I went back and played the message again on my phone. The sound had degraded, the whisper was barely there, and the wind sound was more muffled. By 10 p.m., the message had disappeared. I hadn't deleted it, it was just gone. I couldn't find the voicemail I knew had been there earlier that day. I searched through every single folder and even dialed my voicemail number directly, but there was no trace of a message. I sat bewildered, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was a spoofed call, or perhaps someone had used a voice clip of mine. But all it said was my name, which was odd since I never post any videos or voice content online. That night, I went to bed around midnight and left my phone on the nightstand, still powered on. At 2:43 a.m., the phone's screen suddenly lit up without any sound. The voicemail icon appeared again. Initially, I just stared at it, not wanting to touch the phone, half expecting something else to happen. After a few minutes of nothing else occurring, I hesitantly checked the phone. It showed one new voicemail from an unknown number, time-stamped at 2:43 a.m., almost exactly 12 hours from the first mysterious call. This one lasted 17 seconds, starting with louder static and what sounded like fabric rubbing against a microphone. Then, my name was whispered a bit clearer than before, followed by a low, rhythmic noise that hardly sounded human. It was too mechanical, almost as if it was trying to mimic breathing. It was a pattern of 3 beats, a pause, and then 3 more beats. My name was whispered again, this time more drawn out. I saved the message and put my phone in a drawer, unable to listen to it again. The rest of the night, I couldn't sleep. That pattern of 3 beats haunted me, almost syncing with my own breathing. I played music to try and block it out. The next morning, the voicemail had vanished again with no history that it was ever there. I went to work, acted as normal as possible, and kept checking my phone. Nothing unusual happened during the day. However, the next night at 2:41 a.m., my phone lit up again. This time, it didn't even ring, and there was no voicemail icon or call history. Just a text from an unknown sender. The message contained just one word: listening. I stared at the screen until it dimmed. At first, I wasn't even scared, just numb, unsure how to react. I tried to respond with, "Who is this?" but the message wouldn't send. It just showed a spinning wheel next to the text, and then the whole thread vanished. I turned off my phone, pulled out the battery, and left it off for the rest of the night. The following day, I took my phone to the Verizon store. They ran diagnostics and assured me everything was in order, no signs of malware or any other issues. I was enjoying a quiet day out on the water, anchored in a familiar little bay where I'd been fishing for years. It's a peaceful spot, not much more than a shallow cove surrounded by trees where boat traffic is scarce, allowing me to focus solely on fishing. That afternoon, the sky was clear and a gentle breeze was blowing. I had set up my usual gear: a fishing rod, tackle box, and a couple of compasses for navigation and checking bearings. The water was calm and smooth, and I was patiently waiting for the fish to bite. However, something odd happened with my compasses. Initially, the needles just started to twitch slightly, as if they were uneasy. Then, within minutes, all the compasses, the handheld one, the one on my GPS, and even the one built into my old watch, began spinning wildly, completing full 360-degree turns repeatedly. It was as if they weren't anchored by any magnetic field. I scanned my surroundings for anything that could be causing magnetic interference: my phone, keys, the boat's engine, but nothing had changed. The engine was off, and I hadn't moved any potential sources of interference. As I tried to figure out what was happening with the compasses, I noticed the water beneath the boat had changed. It wasn't calm as before. Instead, small bubbles started rising, as if the water was boiling slowly, yet there were no disturbances from wind or waves. The scene was bizarre, with the water appearing almost alive, simmering just under the boat. The compasses continued their frantic spinning for nearly 3 minutes. In a completely different but equally unsettling incident, I had to deal with an unknown caller. There had been no recent updates, and when I asked if the unknown number could be tracked, the response was that it was probably a spoof or a network error. They suggested wiping my phone, but I declined. Instead, I bought a burner phone, a cheap pay-as-you-go model, and gave the number only to my sister and my boss. I left my other phone switched off, tucked away in a drawer at home. A week passed without incident, then one night, the burner rang. There was no caller ID, just an anonymous ring. I didn't answer, and it went to voicemail. When I checked it, there was no message, just the sound of wind, flat and steady, as if recorded in a vacuum. There was no other noise, no whispers, just that wind. His phone had no internet, no apps, no Bluetooth, nothing that should have allowed anyone to trace it or send something strange. It wasn't even registered under my name. I still have the phone and the voicemail. Sometimes I play it to remind myself that I didn't imagine it. The sound is always the same, never louder or quieter, as if it's stuck in time. I was out on the water, the boat anchored firmly, not moving an inch. The gentle rocking was the only movement I felt until the compasses started spinning wildly, as if caught in an invisible whirl. After a dizzying moment, they abruptly stopped but didn't align north. Each pointed in a different direction, none of which made any sense to me. I sat there, puzzled, watching as the water, which had been bubbling up from below, slowed down to a complete stillness. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, the bay seemed to darken unusually fast. It was quiet, too quiet, except for the occasional dripping sound from my fishing rod holder and the subtle creaking of the boat. Despite the oddness, I felt an inexplicable urge to stay put, to see if anything else strange would occur. Minutes passed, and I decided to check my phone for the time and weather, only for it to flicker and go black. After a couple of attempts to restart it, it finally turned back on, showing that nearly an hour had passed. A whole hour that felt like no more than 10 minutes. I was still reeling from the disorientation when I started the engine and the compasses returned to normal, as did my phone signal. Later that night, after docking, I checked for any unusual activity like earthquakes or storms in the local news and weather reports, but there was nothing. The next day, curiosity got the better of me, and I returned to the same spot with a friend. Everything was as it should be, the water calm, the compasses steady. We even used a magnetometer app to test the area, but it detected nothing unusual. I've gone back several times since that day, experienced nothing but regular fishing in peaceful waters. Yet, I can't shake off the memory of the spinning compasses and the bubbling water, nor the mysterious time gap that had appeared on my phone. Something unexplainable was there that day, and it still plays on my mind. Driving through the desert at 2 a.m. during a late-night haul, the road stretched empty ahead and behind me. I'd been driving for hours, the landscape enveloped in darkness, feeling every bit of my fatigue. I first noticed something strange in my rearview mirror. Initially, I mistook the flickering for taillights, or perhaps a group of trucks, but it was different. These lights, tightly clustered and bright, seemed to be tracking me. At first, I thought maybe they were other truckers in a convoy, but their movement didn't fit any typical vehicle pattern. As I adjusted my speed, the lights mirrored my changes exactly, maintaining a constant distance behind me, almost as if they were tethered to my truck. The road behind me was eerily empty. No cars, no trucks, just those unblinking, steady lights. They weren't flashing like normal headlights or taillights. They were unusually consistent, like a set of flashlights or LEDs suspended in midair. I kept glancing over my shoulder, trying to see better, but the road was deserted except for those persistent lights. The desert around me was silent and vast, devoid of towns or street lamps, just open highway under the starlit sky. Curious and slightly unnerved, I tested them by switching lanes and even slowing down, hoping they might pass or at least change their behavior, but they clung to their course, following every move I made. After about 20 minutes, driven by a mix of fatigue and a need to understand, I decided to pull over at the next rest stop. I figured a break was due, and perhaps the lights would continue on, or disappear once I stopped. As I pulled off into the rest stop and turned off my engine, the lights vanished instantly from my mirror. No gradual fade, just gone. I looked around the empty parking lot and into the darkness of the desert. Nothing but silence. Sitting there, the cool desert air felt heavy, almost expectant. I reached for my CB radio to check in and let someone know I was taking a break, but instead of the usual crackle, it emitted a strange, high-pitched hum, like feedback but steadier, deeper, devoid of any static or voices. I messed with the radio knobs, switching between stations and adjusting the volume. The annoying hum remained constant, softly buzzing inside the truck, not loud enough to be painful but impossible to ignore. I turned the radio off, which stopped the hum instantly, yet the odd sensation lingered. Stepping out, I surveyed the surroundings, nothing but the dark desert and an empty parking lot. No other vehicles, no distant lights, no movement at all. My phone was no help either, showing no signal, which was typical for such a remote area. Feeling too jittery to just sit idle, I decided it was best to keep moving. Back inside, I restarted the truck and flicked the radio on to check for the hum. Silence greeted me this time. As I merged back onto the highway, I noticed the lights in the rearview mirror, their bright cluster hauntingly steady, trailing me like a group of static fireflies. Whether I sped up or slowed down, they matched my pace as if bound to me. For the next hour, I alternated my focus between the road ahead and the mysterious lights behind me. I tried everything to get a reaction, waving, flashing my high beams, even honking, but nothing changed. They simply followed, silent and unresponsive. The thought of stopping at another rest area crossed my mind, but options were scarce, and I was reluctant to lose sight of the peculiar phenomenon. Eventually, I veered off onto a dirt road, testing if the lights would persist. They did. Driving slowly, the lights maintained their distance, consistently bright. It was then the CB radio began to emit a high-pitched hum again, faint yet unmistakable. I quickly shut it off, but the hum continued, seemingly emanating from the truck itself this time. I pulled over, contemplating reaching out for help, but again, my phone showed no service. What struck me then was the eerie silence enveloping the desert. Typically alive with the sounds of crickets, the rustle of the wind, or distant coyote calls, tonight it was unnervingly quiet, void of even the breeze. I glanced at my watch, but time seemed irrelevant in the face of the unsettling quiet and the persistent, inexplicable followers. It felt like the lights had been following me forever, stretching time into a strange, twisted loop. I turned the truck around, heading back towards the highway, yet the lights persisted, trailing behind, but keeping a bit more distance once I hit the main road. I sped up, trying to shake them off, but they kept pace. As dawn approached and the sky lightened, the lights began to dim, sinking like they were disappearing below the horizon. By sunrise, they faded away entirely. Exhausted and puzzled, I pulled over, turned off the truck, and sat in silence, radio off, trying to make sense of what had happened. The remainder of my journey was calm, with no mysterious lights or unsettling feelings. When I finally got home, I checked my rig thoroughly for any signs of electrical faults or strange wires. Nothing. I still can't explain the humming noise on the CB radio or why it occurred only when the lights were present. I haven't experienced anything like that since, and sometimes I doubt if it was all real. Yet, the vivid memory of how those lights matched my speed and the eerie hum that seemed to bring the truck to life are hard to dismiss. That bewildering night in the desert remains unexplained. Perhaps it always will. Later that same evening, just after 9 p.m., the power suddenly went out. It was an unusual blackout with no storm or warning. Everything just stopped. The entire neighborhood plunged into darkness and silence, broken only by the faint sound of generators and neighbors' hushed voices. I was at home, finishing dinner when the blackout struck. The lights blinked out, the TV and laptop died, and my phone stopped charging. Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped outside for some fresh air and to make sense of the sudden quiet that had replaced the usual city sounds. The street was pitch black, apart from sporadic beams of flashlight moving along the sidewalk. Most houses were dark, their windows mere black voids. A few neighbors gathered in small groups, whispering, trying to figure out what had caused the blackout. I wandered down the block, flashlight in hand, the cool air filled with the odd stillness of a suddenly silent night. Last fall, around mid-October, I was returning from a weekend trip to visit my cousin in Central Oregon. The drive is roughly 6 hours, mostly on empty highways and through stretches of nothing, especially during the last couple of hours. I left later than I had planned, around 5:30 p.m. As I drove into my neighborhood, everything seemed unusually quiet and dark. The street and porch lights were off, swallowed by the shadows that made everything seem strange and unfamiliar. I noticed that the pavement looked unusually clean, as if it had been washed by a recent rain, even though I hadn't heard any. Looking up, I saw a pale blue light hovering silently about 50 feet above the tallest tree at the edge of the street. It wasn't a spotlight or a plane's navigation light. It was soft, almost glowing, and it pulsed twice in a slow, steady rhythm. The pulses felt deliberate, like a signal or a heartbeat. There was no noise, no wings, no shape that made sense, and it lacked the usual blinking red or green lights that planes have. It just hovered there, too high to be something handheld or a low-flying drone. Everything around me was so still that I could only hear the rustling leaves and my own heartbeat. Then, as suddenly as it had gone dark, the power came back. Streetlights buzzed to life, windows lit up, and the hum of electricity filled the air. At that exact moment, the blue glow pulsed once more and then vanished, as if it had never been there. I looked around. My neighbors had returned to their homes, some still sitting on their porches, laughing about the blackout. No one mentioned the light. I walked back home, feeling unsettled, as if I'd seen something I shouldn't have, yet unsure if it had really happened. Later, I checked my phone for any news about unusual outages, but all I found were updates about the blackout. No one else mentioned seeing any mysterious light. For the next few nights, I went outside, hoping to see the light again, but there was nothing. Just the normal street lights and the quiet trees. Still, I think about that blue light sometimes. It hung there over the treetops, pulsing in the darkness. It didn't make sense. It didn't fit any explanation I have, and I can't figure out why it appeared only during the blackout, only for those brief moments before everything turned back on. Driving late at night near the Crooked River area, things started to feel a bit off. It wasn't that I was tired, but more like I was zoning out. You know, when you've been at the wheel too long, and the road lines begin to blur together, and you can't quite recall the last few minutes of your journey? So, to shake off that feeling, I pulled off onto a gravel shoulder, away from the lights and any other cars, just me and the darkness with my high beams cutting through. I decided to get out, stretch my legs, and use the bathroom behind some bushes. That's when I noticed the rear passenger tire seemed a bit low. Not completely flat, but definitely not right. I crouched down, felt the tire. It was warm and sagging slightly. Maybe I had run over something earlier, though I hadn't heard a hiss or seen any nails. Opting to be cautious, I decided to change it. I grabbed my rechargeable work light from the trunk to light up the area, and in about 10 minutes, I had swapped the tire for the spare. When I climbed back into the car and started it, I looked at the dash clock. It read 11:52, which puzzled me. I clearly remembered it being 11:34 when I first pulled over. I had even taken a screenshot at that time while checking a map, and there was no way the tire change took more than 10 to 12 minutes. Confused, I checked my phone, and it showed 11:38. Thinking maybe the car clock was off, even though it had been accurate throughout the trip, I remembered my dash cam. The cam, a cheap front-facing model, was set to record continuously and save a few minutes of footage on a loop, even when the car was off. Hoping to clear up the time confusion, I planned to check the footage for a record of my stop. When I got home around 2:30 a.m., too keyed up to sleep despite the hour, I popped the memory card from the dash cam into my laptop. The footage was all there, orderly until 11:34, and a few seconds after, then suddenly nothing. There was no file for the next several minutes until 11:48, which showed me closing the trunk and getting back in the car. The video just cut out mid-frame, no fade, just gone, then resumed minutes later. This unexpected gap in the recording left me puzzled as I reviewed the files repeatedly. I came back around to the driver's side, everything looking normal as if nothing had happened. The car hadn't moved an inch, captured from the same camera angle, under the same lighting. I had also checked the rear footage, which is usually lower quality, but it told the same story. It stopped and then picked up again. The audio was the creepiest part. These cameras don't capture sound perfectly. They always sound a bit tinny. Usually, you can at least hear ambient noises like wind or traffic, but after the cut, there was nothing. Before the gap, you could hear me walking, opening the trunk, and the sound of tools clinking. Then suddenly, total silence, as if the microphone had died. You could see me slamming the trunk shut, but not a sound was heard. The silence lasted for about 30 seconds. Then, slowly, the sound crackled back to life as if someone was turning up the volume knob. I thought it might be a battery glitch, but the car was off, and it operated on a separate power source. Plus, the timestamp continued uninterrupted. The camera hadn't restarted. The footage just wasn't there. I tried to shrug it off, thinking I might have spaced out or misread the time, or perhaps the dash cam had overheated. But then, something else added to my confusion. Later, when I was about to throw out a fast food bag from the passenger seat, I noticed my work light. It's the one I used to change tires, and I always put it back in the trunk. I distinctly remembered closing the trunk, and the dash cam footage confirmed that. However, the light was now lying on the back seat floor, turned off, with a smear of dirt across its lens as if it had been dropped. This really threw me off. I live alone. I had locked my car immediately after arriving home and didn't go out the next day. Yet the light had moved. I went through the memory card again, reviewing each frame before and after the gap. The light was visible in the last frame before the cut, casting a beam towards the road. And then it was just gone. No sign of movement, just missing. Then the next thing you see is me, and the trunk is shut. For a while, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I had moved the light and forgotten. Maybe I took longer than I thought, or maybe the camera had malfunctioned precisely during those crucial minutes. But I couldn't shake the eerie feeling, especially thinking back to the sudden audio cut, as if someone had hit mute. 2 weeks later, another odd thing happened. I was reorganizing my glove box and found my tire pressure gauge jammed in sideways behind the manuals. I hadn't seen it that night, so I just used the visual sag to check the tires. That night kept playing back in my mind, filled with unanswerable questions. We were camping out at Whitley Lake late in September, taking advantage of one of the last warm weekends before the cold nights set in. It was just the four of us, me, my brother Ryan, and our friends Luke and Jen. The camping spot we chose wasn't official, just a flat patch near the tree line, down a short walk from the dirt road, close to a bend where the water's deeper. It's shaped kind of like a crooked horseshoe, tapering into a marsh at the narrow end. Though it's not marked on any maps, locals know it well. It's a quiet, secluded spot, perfect for what we wanted, a weekend away from everything. We arrived on Friday evening and spent most of that first night around the fire, just talking and drinking, not heading to bed until after 1 a.m. Saturday was relaxed. We spent the day fishing and cooking what we caught. There was no cell service, which was exactly the point, just us, the woods, and the water. Around 9:30 that night, we were all sitting in our folding chairs by the dying fire, the lake completely still, like glass, without a ripple. Suddenly, Jen leaned forward, squinting at the lake, and pointed, "What is that?" We all looked to see a pale, possibly bluish light, hard to tell from our distance. It wasn't moving fast, just slowly rising from the middle of the lake. At first, I thought it might be a reflection, but it was clear it came from beneath the surface, ascending steadily until it hovered about 6 feet above the water. We all stood up, not saying a word, transfixed. The light didn't flicker or wobble, just hung in the air. I quickly checked for any logical explanation. A boat, someone with a flashlight, but there was nothing. No engine hum, no distant voices, and suddenly the fire behind us seemed too loud, as if everything else had fallen silent. We watched the light for what seemed like forever, but was probably only about 10 seconds. I always keep my things in the same place. For instance, my tire gauge. I keep it in the trunk now, and I check it regularly. I still drive down that same road occasionally, though not as often. I also replaced the dash cam in my car. It was still working, but I didn't like how it had cut out previously, almost as if it chose not to record, not to show me something it sensed I wasn't supposed to see. Every time I stop, I make it a point to check the clock on the dash against my phone. Nothing odd has happened since then, but it's better to be cautious. I was working the overnight shift at a 24-hour pharmacy just outside St. Louis, manning the front register and restocking shelves. It's generally a quiet job, mostly old folks coming in at odd hours for their meds, and occasionally a sketchy character looking for cold medicine we no longer carry. One night in January, around 2:30 a.m., I noticed a man standing across the street. At first, I thought he was waiting for a ride since he was right by the curb. Back at the lake, something strange happened that none of us could explain. A light appeared over the water, looking like it could be a drone or a flare. But then it moved in an odd way, smoothly ascending and descending, touching the water without causing a ripple. It was as if it had never been there. The lake remained perfectly still, no splash, no ripples, just nothing. Luke laughed awkwardly, more out of nerves than amusement, while Jen sat back down quietly and Ryan kept his eyes fixed on the water. We all felt it was too strange to go to bed right after witnessing that, So we stayed by the lake for another half hour, uneasy about turning our backs on whatever it was we had just seen. Eventually, we headed to our tents, but sleep hardly came. Every sound seemed amplified, and at one point, I thought I heard footsteps near the water, but I was too unnerved to check. The next morning, we packed up in silence, operating almost on autopilot. Ryan was the first to speak, questioning if what we saw was a boat light, which Jen and Luke quickly dismissed. We went down to the shore, half expecting to find some evidence like oil or a scorch mark, but the water looked undisturbed, eerily still. Ryan threw a rock into the lake, causing a normal splash and ripple, which somehow made the previous night's events feel even more unsettling. Without much discussion, we skipped breakfast and coffee, packed our things, and left. The drive back was quiet, and I kept thinking about the calmness of the water after the light vanished, as if it had never touched it. I didn't mention it to anyone for weeks until I casually brought it up to a coworker who fishes in that area. He joked about it being swamp gas, and I let the conversation die there. I haven't returned to the lake since. Under the glow of an old sodium street lamp in the parking lot of the self-storage place across from our store, he stood. He was a tall man, easily over 6 feet, draped in a heavy coat and a hat with the brim pulled low over his face. From my spot behind the counter, I couldn't make out much else about him. He wasn't doing anything noticeable, not pacing, not on his phone, just standing there, facing our direction. I watched him for a few minutes, curious, until a customer pulled my attention away. When I glanced back, he had disappeared. It struck me as odd, but I shrugged it off. However, the very next night, there he was again. Same time, same spot. He was like a statue. No smoking, no fidgeting, nothing. I watched him intently between serving customers, noting that he never changed his posture. Curiosity got the better of me, and I edged towards the front door, peering out into the cold without actually stepping outside. The gate to the storage lot was securely locked, and the office had long since closed. I wondered if perhaps he was waiting for someone, or maybe he was homeless, just passing time. The mystery continued into a third night, which prompted me to mention it to Mark, the pharmacist I worked with. "You ever notice that guy across the street?" I asked, pointing out the window. Mark strained his eyes and responded, "What guy?" By then, the man had vanished again, which made me drop the subject for the time being. The following night, he was back. This time, I pushed the door open slightly and leaned out for a clearer view. The cold air stung, but I called out a tentative, "Hey," to him. There was no reaction. He didn't even seem to hear me. A bit unnerved, I locked the door and returned to my post, watching him silently from behind the glass. Every night, for about a week, he appeared like clockwork, always in the same spot, in the same stance. The regularity of his presence started to make me tense, feeling watched even when I wasn't looking directly at him. To ease my mind, I began checking the security cameras more frequently. Our store had a dome camera aimed out the front doors and another overlooking the parking lot, both feeding into a modest monitor in the manager's office. I started scrolling through the recordings, searching for any clue as to who the man might be or what he wanted. I remember nights when I would see him, but the recordings showed nothing. No movement across the street, no figure under the streetlight. At first, I thought the cameras weren't catching that area, so during a break, I tested their range. I stood under the light and waved my arms. The playback clearly showed me, so he should have shown up too, but he didn't. Even when I compared the saved clips with live sightings on my phone, the feed showed empty spaces where he should have been, visible on the store's cameras. This really spooked me. After that, I started taking pictures with my phone whenever I spotted him. Most were blurry or too dark, but a couple turned out clear enough. I showed them to Mark, but he was dismissive, suggesting they might just be shadows and clearly not wanting to delve deeper. The last time I saw him was a chilly Thursday night. It had lightly snowed earlier, and by 2:30 a.m., the sidewalks were icy. I was habitually checking the window every few minutes, and there he was again. This time, he was much closer, right at the edge of our lot, and still under the streetlight. As I watched, a chilling detail became apparent. There were no footprints in the snow leading to where he stood. The sidewalk from the street to his spot was undisturbed. Smooth snow stretched all the way to the curb. No tracks at all. I stared, trying to make sense of it. Compelled, I opened the door and called out, asking if he was okay. No response. My heart raced as I gripped the door handle, feeling an inexplicable sense of dread. He hadn't moved at all, but something felt profoundly wrong. After about 30 seconds, I retreated and shut the door, heading to the back office to check the monitors. The spot where he stood was empty on the screen, just black and white asphalt. I rushed back to the front, and he was still there, unchanged. I took another photo with my phone, zooming in on his face, or rather where his face should have been. It was obscured, likely by the hat, or perhaps it wasn't there at all, just darkness under the brim. Not a shadow, but an absence of features, no reflection of skin, nothing. I backed away, locked myself in the back room, and waited out the night, unsettled by the whole experience. Mark, I really didn't know how to even explain what I saw. I went back to the window around 3:15, and he was gone. He never showed up again. I kept looking for a while, checking the cameras and the lot, even crossed the street once during the day to see if there were any signs someone had been there. Cigarette butts, trash, anything. There was nothing. I've still got the photo. It's grainy and dark, and most people I've shown it to just say it's probably a coat rack or something, but I know what I saw. I was out on this hill just outside town, trying to capture some star trail shots. I'd been meaning to do it for a while, just for fun. Nothing fancy, just my DSLR on a tripod pointed straight up, set to a long exposure. I figured I'd get some decent photos of the night sky, stars spinning around that Big Dipper, maybe catch a meteor or two if I was lucky. I set everything up around 11 p.m. when the sky was clear and dark. No clouds, no moon, just stars everywhere. I liked that spot because it was quiet and far enough from the city lights. The air was cold but not freezing. I wrapped myself in a jacket and hit the shutter. I set the exposure for about 5 minutes, figuring that would give me a good trail without overdoing it. I sat back on a rock nearby, staring up. The sky looked amazing, just black with all those tiny points of light. I wasn't expecting much beyond the usual stars, a few planes, maybe a satellite slowly moving along. After the exposure finished, I looked at the screen on my camera to check the photo. The star trails were beautiful, smooth circular arcs as expected, but then I noticed something else. A thin streak of light, like a line, was crossing the trails, but it wasn't following the usual pattern. Normally, if there's a plane or satellite, it moves in a straight line, consistent with the Earth's rotation, so it either goes with the curve of the trails or runs roughly straight across. But this one was different. The streak started at the bottom left of the frame, heading diagonally up toward the right. That wasn't unusual in itself. What got me was that halfway through the exposure, it abruptly changed direction, like it suddenly veered off at a sharp angle, almost a right turn, and continued across the sky, going a completely different way. It didn't look like any plane I'd seen, and satellites don't just turn mid-flight like that. I zoomed in on the photo, trying to make sense of it. I was hiking a familiar trail in the foothills near my hometown, a path I've trodden many times before, winding through old pines and scrub. It was late afternoon, the sun beginning to dip, filling the air with the earthy scent left after a light rain. My pack was loaded with the usual: water, snacks, a compass, and my phone. I don't rely much on GPS here because the signal is spotty, so the compass acts as my backup. Starting out, everything was normal, just the crunch of my boots and occasional calls from birds. I had planned to walk maybe 2 or 3 miles out and then head back. Everything changed when I decided to take some photos. The first picture I snapped seemed normal, but when I checked my camera, I noticed a strange streak of light with a sharp, clean turn, almost like it was being steered. At first, I shrugged it off, thinking it might be a glitch or something off with the camera's exposure. So, I reset the camera and took another shot. There it was again, the same odd streak in almost the same spot. Now feeling uneasy, I scanned the sky with my eyes, hoping to spot whatever it was causing this. But there was nothing, no planes, no satellites moving that way, just still stars. The surroundings grew eerily quiet, and I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. Even though I was alone, except for the trees and the dark hill, This feeling lingered. After about an hour, I packed up, but as I walked back to my car, I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like something was out there in the dark. I didn't see anything, but the sensation stayed with me all the way home. Once home, I downloaded the photos onto my computer to take a closer look. That streak was still there in every image, always making that sharp turn halfway through the exposure. None of the other lights in the sky behaved that way. I thought about showing the photos to someone, but hesitated, worried I might be missing something obvious or perhaps misinterpreting the whole thing. Yet, I couldn't deny what I saw in those photos, and I had no explanation for it. Since that day, I've returned to the same spot a few times, hoping to either capture it again or see it with my own eyes. But all I've seen are normal stars and the occasional plane, all moving in straight lines. I still wonder about that light, what it was, and where it came from. About an hour into my hike, things started feeling a bit off. I had stopped to check my compass out of habit while overlooking a valley from a small ridge. Usually steady, the needle began moving slowly, making deliberate, almost spinning motions, completing a full rotation every 10 to 15 seconds. With no obvious sources of magnetic interference around, just trees and dirt, I watched in confusion until it finally stopped and pointed north again. Thinking it might just be a malfunction, I slipped it back into my pocket and continued on my way. 20 minutes later, I noticed the trail had become narrower, the trees denser, and the sunlight dimmer than before. The path seemed unfamiliar, like I had accidentally veered off without realizing it, though I didn't recall passing any forks or side trails. Checking my phone for guidance, I found the GPS wasn't working, and I couldn't get a signal. An uneasy feeling started to settle in as I pressed forward, hoping to find something recognizable. The trail seemed to twist more than usual, and when I checked my compass again, it pointed north, steady this time. However, the surroundings didn't match up. The ridge I thought I had passed and the valley view were nowhere to be seen. Attempting to backtrack, I only found the path looping back into more dense and quiet forest, giving a sense that I was venturing deeper into the unknown. Then, a strange low humming broke the silence. Initially, it seemed like the wind, but it was too mechanical, resonating from all directions, almost as if emanating from the woods themselves. No signs of power lines or towers were in sight, yet the humming persisted, unsettling me further. As the sun began to set, shadows elongated into bizarre shapes, flickering at the corner of my eye, disappearing when I tried to look directly at them. The feeling of being watched crept over me, suggesting a presence lurking just out of view. I continued, more cautious now, frequently checking my compass, which, after a while, started to spin again, albeit slower. Stopping dead in my tracks, I couldn't shake the feeling that something very unusual was happening. The forest seemed to hold a secret, and I was right in the middle of it. The compass needle was acting up, pointing straight south unexpectedly, and that was my first clue that something was off. I decided to head back the way I came, but the scenery was eerily identical in every direction. The same trees, the same scatter of dead leaves, and familiar little rock formations made it feel like I was walking in circles. Pulling out my phone for some guidance, I got nothing. No signal, no GPS, and not even a successful call to my wife. Despite a full battery confirmed by double-checking, my phone was useless out there. I glanced at the compass again, watching the needle spin, and then settle back to north. And that's when I realized I was somehow back at the trailhead without ever having turned around or taken a different path. Surrounded by the same sights, the worn trail sign, the peeling sticker, my car in its spot, it was baffling. No time had passed according to my watch, the same time as when I'd started my hike, yet I felt the weight of those 2 hours on my legs. The parking lot was right there, unchanged, feeling a tightness in my chest. I couldn't make sense of how I ended up where I began after such a long walk. I drove straight home, not taking any other roads. At home, my phone still showed only the old messages, no signs of missed calls or texts. That night, sleep was elusive, haunted by the humming in my ears and visions of the erratic compass needle. I've returned to that trail, but never the same route. What happened that day remains a mystery, but I steer clear of letting it repeat. I don't think I ever will.